Ed Ruth Taylor, the troublemaking son of one of the highest-ranking noble families, had once ruled the academy like a king, feared by everyone around him. He enjoyed abusing his authority without a second thought. But in a single day, everything came crashing down. He was removed from the family registry, disowned by his own relatives, and thrown out of his home. It felt as though fate itself was mocking him. His life as he knew it was over. Back at the academy, the students couldn't stop whispering. Some told the others to lower their voices, worried that Ed might hear them. Others simply laughed, saying there was no reason to fear him anymore since he had already been disowned. Many believed he wouldn't even return next semester, while others claimed this outcome was inevitable after he cheated on the academy's entrance exam. The only problem was that the Ed everyone hated wasn't actually him. The real Ed was an ordinary guy who had somehow been transported into his favorite game, the failed swordsman of Sylvania. He had expected to become the powerful protagonist, a talented noble, or at least an important side character. Instead, he was reincarnated as the game's most insignificant villain, Ed Ruth Taylor, a third-rate antagonist who gets kicked out of the dormitory almost as soon as the story begins. Out of every character in the game, he had somehow become the absolute worst choice. He couldn't understand why this had happened. In his previous life, he had lived quietly, never chasing power or causing trouble. So why had he ended up trapped inside the body of someone destined for failure? As the surrounding students continued mocking him, Ed could only stand there in silence. Later, after checking his status, he realized just how hopeless his situation truly was. His attributes were unbelievably terrible. He had only 3 stamina, 4 intellect, 7 talent, 7 willpower, and 6 luck. He was attending the most prestigious magic academy on the continent, with only 4 points in intelligence. No wonder the original Ed was nothing more than a disposable villain. Trying to remember the game's story, Ed realized that this character only appeared during the early chapters before disappearing completely. Even his memories of him were vague. Then he suddenly remembered something from the game's ending credits. Ed Ruth Taylor briefly appeared as a homeless beggar, desperately asking people for food. Considering everything that had happened, that ending made perfect sense. A spoiled noble who suddenly lost everything and knew nothing about surviving in the real world would be lucky just to stay alive. Taking a deep breath, Ed calmed himself. He had no idea why he had been brought into this world, but one thing was certain. He refused to accept that miserable ending. Somehow, no matter how difficult it became, he would survive and change his fate. The academy itself wasn't just a school. It was practically an entire city built around Arcane Mountain. After being thrown out, Ed wandered into the undeveloped forest northeast of the academy, deliberately avoiding the other students. During that long walk, he carefully analyzed his situation. Fortunately, he had arrived during the very beginning of the game's story. Although he had been disowned by his family and expelled from the dormitory, he was still officially enrolled at Sylvania Academy. That single fact gave him hope. Graduating from Sylvania guaranteed a successful future. Better yet, since he had already completed the game 5 times, he possessed knowledge of countless future events. If he stayed out of trouble, survived the academy, and graduated normally, he could live a comfortable life. Picking up a stick, he wrote one word in the dirt: graduation. That would become his new goal. Unfortunately, reality immediately reminded him of another problem: money. His tuition for the current semester had already been paid, but after that he would need to earn a scholarship. Looking at his pathetic stats, that seemed almost impossible. Still, scholarships could wait. Right now he needed something much more important: food, shelter, clothes. Opening his large suitcase, he searched through everything he owned. Inside were expensive noble clothes, a ceremonial dagger with no practical use, and an ornamental cup that served as little more than decoration. At least he had something to wear. Food and shelter, however, were another story. Thanks to the original Ed's horrible reputation, finding work around the academy would be nearly impossible. Returning to the dormitory wasn't an option either, since he had already been expelled. Left with no other choice, Ed decided to survive inside the forest. Fortunately, a nearby stream could provide fresh water. There were still 10 days before classes officially began. Until then, he would prepare himself. His first step was practicing magic. Using Windblade, he repeatedly sliced through small trees. The spell still worked, but it was incredibly weak. After cutting down only 15 tree stumps, he was already completely exhausted. As hunger began taking over, he suddenly remembered something his grandfather once told him. During times of starvation, people supposedly survived by eating tree bark. Trusting that old advice, Ed collected pieces of wood, filled his cup with water from the stream, and cooked them using fire magic. After staring at the finished result, he convinced himself it looked somewhat like chicken breast. The moment he took a bite, he immediately regretted it. Seconds later, he was violently throwing up. 2 miserable days passed. Sitting beside the stream on the 3rd day, Ed could only sigh. He officially hated his grandfather. After starving for days and vomiting repeatedly, he finally accepted one simple truth: wood was not food. It was building material, so instead of trying to eat it, he began constructing a shelter. The work wasn't easy. With only 2 hands, raising the support beams alone proved incredibly difficult. Even so, after hours of struggling, he finally managed to tie together the basic frame. It still wasn't comfortable. He spread several expensive pieces of clothing across the ground to use as bedding, despite knowing it was a complete waste. By the end of the night, he had finally finished his tiny wooden shelter. Just then, a system notification suddenly appeared. He had successfully learned the skill, Basic Wooden Shelter. The system rated it at half a star and classified him as a novice craftsman with no specialization. His crafting attributes were also displayed. Mana level 1. Gathering level 1. Surprised, Ed realized that the crafting system was active as well. The system explained that although he had grown up as a noble, he actually possessed greater talent for crafting than for magic. Honestly, that suited him perfectly. Practical survival skills were far more valuable than weak spells. With renewed motivation, Ed crafted a simple wooden harpoon and headed toward the stream. Catching fish with his current abilities should have been impossible, but hunger gave him determination. After countless failed attempts, he finally managed to spear several fish. Using fire magic, he roasted them over an open flame. Finally eating real food after days of suffering, Ed almost couldn't believe how delicious they tasted. There was only 1 week left before classes resumed. If he could survive until then, everything else could be figured out later. However, just as he prepared to eat another fish, someone suddenly approached him. A young girl calmly asked, "Are you Ed Ruth Taylor?" The moment he saw her face, Ed's heart sank. Of all the people he could have encountered, she was the absolute worst. Her name was Fania. In the original story, Ed Ruth Taylor was the first villain the player ever faced. After abusing his noble status to harass the protagonist's childhood friend, he was beaten up. Seeking revenge, he later sabotaged the protagonist's entrance examination. Unfortunately for him, his scheme was exposed by a mysterious girl hiding her true identity. That girl was none other than Fania alias Chloe, the third princess of the Chloe Empire. Using her unique inspection skill, she could detect lies and uncover hidden conspiracies. Every excuse the original Ed tried to make had been completely exposed, leading to his expulsion from the dormitory. Now she stood before him once again. Looking at him coldly, Fania asked why he was still here. Ed calmly replied that although he had been kicked out of the dormitory, he was still officially enrolled as a student. Fania wasn't satisfied. She declared that it wouldn't stay that way for long. Calling him shameless, she announced that she would personally speak with the academy's administration and request his complete expulsion. Meanwhile, Ed glanced toward the fire. His fish was burning. After nearly starving for 3 days, losing his meal was already painful enough. But compared to the possibility of being expelled from the academy altogether, the burned fish was the least of his worries. Ed quickly realized just how dangerous his situation was. Fania wasn't simply another student. She was the third princess of the empire, and if she truly wanted him expelled, she had more than enough influence to make it happen. Since he couldn't win through force, he decided to gamble everything on words. Looking directly at Fania, Ed calmly pointed out that the sun would soon set. At a time like this, there were no heavily armed royal guards protecting her. He casually remarked that it was rather strange for a princess to be wandering alone through such an isolated forest. Fania narrowed her eyes. Is that a threat? She warned him that if he was trying to intimidate her, he would regret it. Ed immediately shook his head. How could I possibly threaten your highness? Without hesitation, he knelt before her and respectfully thanked her inspection skill. The result was unexpected. He wasn't lying. Ed noticed the brief look of confusion on her face. The Ruth Taylor family was one of the empire's most powerful noble houses, but beneath that prestige hid a rotten legacy. They exploited commoners and secretly conducted horrific human experiments in pursuit of eternal life. Ed already knew their future. Eventually, every member of the family would be arrested and executed for their crimes. Ironically, being disowned had actually saved him. He had lost his status, his wealth, and nearly starved to death, but at least he was still alive. If he wanted to survive, he had to convince Fania without telling a single lie. The moment he lied, her inspection skill would expose him, and his life at the academy would end before it even began. While thinking through everything he knew about the game's timeline, Ed suddenly realized something. There was still 1 week before classes officially started. So why would the princess be wandering through this forest alone? After observing her simple clothes and lack of attendance, the answer immediately came to him. She was taking Professor Glast's placement examination. Professor Glast's test required students to search the forest for hidden magical pearls. The professor was infamous for designing cruel and unusually difficult entrance evaluations. Since Fania was royalty, she would naturally be competing for placement into the academy's highest-ranked Class A. Fania frowned. You're flattering me far too much. It doesn't seem like you've changed at all. She even suggested that perhaps expelling him would be the simplest solution. But Ed confidently replied, if you don't accept my help, you'll never make it into Class A. Then he added one final condition. If I'm lying, you can expel me right here. Fania silently waited for him to continue. Ed explained that deep within the southeastern lake of the forest was a tiny grassy island. At the center of that island stood a massive tree known as the Guardian of Merilda. Hidden beneath that tree was the magical pearl she needed. Trusting her inspection skill, Fenia followed his directions. To her surprise, everything he said was true. Exactly where Ed described, she discovered the golden pearl. Only 3 days earlier, Ed Ruth Taylor had been nothing more than a lying scoundrel in her eyes. Yet now the same person had genuinely helped her without asking for anything in return. She simply stood there, quietly staring at the pearl. Later, back at Sylvania Academy, Professor Glast officially concluded the placement examination and asked every student to submit the magical pearls they had collected. Many students proudly presented flashy pearls overflowing with magical energy. Yet Professor Glast calmly announced that nearly everyone would still begin in Class F. The students were completely shocked. The professor explained that the examination wasn't about collecting the strongest pearl. Even an ordinary pearl could earn placement into Class A, provided it was the correct one. Only 3 students had succeeded. The first was Zix, the second was Lortel, the third was the student who discovered the legendary pearl hidden beneath the Guardian of Merilda, the most difficult location in the entire forest. That student was Fenia. Not only did she earn Class A, but she also claimed the highest rank among all incoming students. Meanwhile, none of this mattered to Ed. Back in the forest, he stared helplessly at another burned fish. Completely exhausted, he no longer had the energy to continue hunting with a spear. Instead, he crafted a crude fishing rod to make catching food easier. At the same time, the story revealed the true nature of Fenia's unique ability. Ever since childhood, she had been surrounded by flattery, manipulation, and deception. Those experiences eventually awakened her innate skill, inspection, which allowed her to detect lies with absolute certainty. No one could deceive her. That was exactly why Ed had no choice but to speak honestly every time they met. However, another problem soon became obvious. In the original game, Princess Fenia failed Professor Glast's placement examination and was assigned to Class F. That setback became the first major turning point in her character development. But now everything had changed. Because of Ed's interference, she found the Golden Pearl and entered Class A from the very beginning. The original storyline had already started falling apart. Ed couldn't help but worry. If the game's events continued changing, then all the future knowledge he relied upon could become completely useless. Still, there was one reassuring detail. The top student was still supposed to be Lucy Merrill. As long as that remained unchanged, perhaps the future hadn't completely gone off course yet. Meanwhile, Fenia reflected on everything that had happened. Her inspection skill had confirmed that Ed never lied. The pearl truly existed. Yet she couldn't accept calling it a gift. She hadn't found it through her own ability. As a princess, she refused to receive special treatment simply because of her royal blood. More than anything else, she wanted to prove her own worth through her own efforts. Although accepting the pearl would guarantee her first place, deep down she believed she didn't deserve it. The title she would one day earn, the Princess of Love, wasn't given because of her status or abilities. It was a title she gained by always choosing the righteous path, no matter how difficult it became. Back in the forest, Ed assumed he had successfully taken the bait. Whether she accepted the pearl or not didn't really matter to him. He had spoken nothing but the truth, and that was enough. Unable to ignore the mystery surrounding him any longer, Fenia quietly decided she would keep a close eye on Ed Ruth Taylor from now on. At that exact moment, completely unaware of her decision, Ed finally caught another fish. After days of hardship, he couldn't help smiling with genuine excitement. A few days later, the long-awaited morning finally arrived. Ed hurried toward the academy, determined not to be late. The new semester at Sylvania Academy was officially beginning. Students who had completed the placement examination gathered together as the opening ceremony prepared to start. As Ed walked through the campus, whispers immediately spread among the crowd. Many students couldn't believe he had the nerve to return after everything that had happened. Others wondered if he actually intended to stay at the academy. Surprisingly, none of those insults bothered him anymore. After everything he had survived in the forest, even their poisonous words sounded almost comforting. Simply being back at the academy felt like a reward. He quietly sat down and enjoyed the academy's delicious food with perfect table manners. His goal had never changed. He didn't want power. He didn't want fame. He simply wanted to graduate and live a peaceful life. Some students continued mocking him for his disgrace during the entrance examination. However, others began noticing something unusual. If they looked closely, Ed seemed completely different from before. One student even commented that the way he ate was incredibly refined, like someone who truly belonged among the academy's nobles. Ed ignored every comment. Their opinions meant nothing to him. Soon afterward, the headmaster stepped forward and officially welcomed everyone to the new semester at Sylvania Academy. He praised the students for growing stronger during the examination period and expressed his hopes that they would continue developing as members of the academy. As the ceremony continued, Ed couldn't help remembering that he had almost been expelled before classes had even started. He hadn't expected Fenia to speak to the headmaster on his behalf, Since he was still standing there as an official student, she must have said something favorable about him. Even the notoriously grumpy old headmaster greeted Ed with a smile. Still, Ed knew this was only the beginning. From now on, he would have to be even more careful. If the story drifted too far from the original game's plot, every advantage he possessed could disappear. Fortunately, his time surviving alone in the forest hadn't been wasted. Besides improving his survival skills, he had also unlocked practical combat abilities, including proficiency with the bow, a skill that might prove invaluable in the challenges that awaited him. Besides his newly acquired survival skills, Ed had also received proper magical training as a student of Sylvania Academy. Combining magic with physical combat, he realized there was no better weapon for him than a bow. As his abilities steadily improved, he became increasingly skilled at crafting high-quality arrows, and even learned how to infuse them with magical and spiritual formulas, making each shot far more powerful than an ordinary arrow. One day, while walking through the forest, Ed noticed someone sitting peacefully beneath the guardian of Marilda tree. It was Janica Failover. She was the Academy's top second-year student and a genius spirit mage. The moment she spotted him, she smiled brightly. "So you're the funny guy Marilda told me about." Before Ed could even react, she had already appeared right in front of him with incredible speed. "You must be Ed Ruth Taylor." She introduced herself politely. "I'm Janica Failover. I'm also a second-year student, but you can just call me Janica." Ed was surprised that she already knew his name, so Janica explained the reason. The forest belonged to Marilda, a high-ranking spirit with whom she had formed a contract. Since Marilda watched over the entire forest, she always knew whenever someone entered her territory. Hearing that, Ed immediately felt guilty. After all, he had been living there for days. During that time, he had cut down several trees and hunted quite a few rabbits just to survive. Janica noticed his uneasy expression and laughed softly. She assured him that Marilda wasn't angry at all. Hunting animals for food and cutting down trees when necessary were simply part of nature's cycle. Even the Great Spirit understood that creatures had to survive. Embarrassed, Ed quietly relaxed. A moment later, Janica extended her hand. A tiny ball of light floated above her palm. "This is one of my contracted spirits," she said happily. "Would you like to touch it?" Ed froze. He immediately realized the problem. He couldn't see spirits at all. Trying to hide his embarrassment, he remained silent. Janica tilted her head. "You can't see it?" Ed admitted the truth before quickly turning away. "I should go look for food." Without waiting for another question, he hurried off. In reality, Ed had deliberately avoided getting close to her. Janica Failover was one of the most important characters in the original game. If he wanted to preserve his knowledge of future events, staying away from her was the smartest decision. Meanwhile, Janica quietly watched him leave. Everything Marilda had said about him was true. He really was fascinating. Even though he couldn't see the spirit, he somehow knew it had taken the form of a giant wolf. Who exactly was Ed Ruth Taylor? He had spoken to her rather coldly, yet somehow he didn't seem like a bad person. Although she assumed they probably wouldn't meet again, she decided she would investigate him more carefully in the future. As the days passed, Ed settled into a brutal routine. The distance between his shelter and Sylvania Academy was enormous, forcing him to leave before sunrise every morning and sprint across the forest just to arrive on time. Ironically, the exhausting commute gradually increased his physical abilities. At the academy, he focused entirely on studying. If he wanted to earn a scholarship and continue attending school, he couldn't afford mediocre grades. Since he had no proper notebooks, he copied everything he learned onto stone slabs, using pieces of burnt wood. He regularly borrowed books from the academy library, carried them back to his shelter, and studied late into the night. Every evening, he washed his clothes in the nearby lake, hoping they would dry before dawn. Then he gathered firewood, collected fresh drinking water, checked his stockpile of dried meat, and prepared enough supplies for the following day. By the time everything was finished, he only managed to sleep about 4 hours each night. Yet surprisingly, none of that was his biggest problem. His biggest problem was Janica. She had started following him everywhere. One day, after noticing her once again trailing behind him, Ed finally stopped walking. "How much longer are you planning to follow me?" Janica looked completely surprised. "So you knew the whole time?" Ed sighed. "It would be stranger if I hadn't noticed." He then reminded her exactly who he was. "I'm Ed Ruth Taylor. People say I'm the worst kind of person imaginable." Even after hearing that, Janica simply continued walking beside him. "That's only what other people think," she replied with a gentle smile. "I haven't decided for myself what kind of person you are." Hearing those words, Ed suddenly remembered something important. Janica had always been this kind of character. On the surface, she appeared innocent, cheerful, and slightly absent-minded, but beneath that gentle smile hid an incredibly dark heart. More importantly, she was the final boss of the first act of the original game. She was also the only person who continued smiling at him despite knowing he belonged to the infamous Ruth Taylor family. Ed wanted nothing to do with someone that important. Unfortunately, fate seemed determined to keep bringing them together. Finally giving up, he decided to ask her for one favor. "My life is a complete mess," he admitted honestly. "I've been disowned by my family, and I'm barely managing to survive." Then he awkwardly asked, "Could you lend me some money? I'll definitely pay you back." Janika's smile became awkward. Although she received a scholarship every year as the top student, it wasn't because she lived comfortably. She came from an extremely poor family. Without that scholarship, she wouldn't even be able to remain at the academy. Money was one thing she simply couldn't spare. "I'm sorry," she said apologetically. "I really can't help." Inside his mind, Ed immediately crossed another dangerous character off his list. Janica eliminated. 3 days later, Ed reflected on everything that had happened. He honestly felt guilty for trying to use her like that. Still, he couldn't risk becoming involved with important characters whose actions shaped the game's story. The less contact he had with them, the safer his future would be. At least, that was what he believed. Returning to his shelter that evening, Ed suddenly froze. Someone was already inside. His heart nearly stopped. Compared to Janica, this person was even more important. Sleeping peacefully inside his tiny shelter was Lucy Merrill. She was the greatest genius in the entire academy and, without question, the strongest character in the original game. After a few moments, Lucy slowly opened her eyes and let out a sleepy yawn. Ed stared at her in complete disbelief. Why was she sleeping inside his shelter? Of all places in the entire mountain, why here? Before he could even ask, Lucy lazily complained that he was being too noisy. Completely confused, Ed asked what he had done. Lucy casually pointed behind him. "It isn't you. It's the enormous wolf standing behind you." Ed turned around but saw absolutely nothing. The giant spirit was apparently trying to communicate with him. Since he couldn't see spirits, Lucy kindly translated its message. It says that one day, no matter what happens, you must save Janica. Ed was completely stunned. Even if the spirit was speaking directly to him, he couldn't hear or see a single thing. Before he could ask any more questions, he suddenly remembered something else. Why was Lucy sleeping alone in the middle of the forest? Lucy simply yawned again, ignored his confusion completely, curled up comfortably, and went right back to sleep. "That's my shelter." After calming down, he finally realized the truth. Lucy was incredibly small and agile. She could leap enormous distances, climb almost anywhere, and treated rooftops, towers, and cliffs as perfect places for afternoon naps. His hidden campsite happened to be quiet, peaceful, and almost impossible for other students to find. Without realizing it, he had built the perfect sleeping spot for Lucy. In other words, this was entirely his own fault. The following day, Ed decided he had to solve the problem before it affected the original storyline. Lucy was so powerful that she casually cast advanced magic while sleeping. If she kept visiting his shelter, the future could change beyond recognition. His first solution was setting a rank D trap. It failed. The next time Lucy appeared, she calmly asked if she could eat some of his dried meat. Ed immediately refused. Lucy ate it anyway. At that point, Ed realized they weren't communicating on the same wavelength at all. No matter what he tried, Lucy continued returning to his shelter again and again. Running out of options, Ed finally remembered the only thing that consistently worked on her. The next time she appeared, he calmly said, "The castle maids have been looking for you." The moment those words left his mouth, Lucy's expression changed. The moment Ed mentioned the dormitory maids, Lucy's sleepy expression vanished. She immediately panicked, claiming she had just remembered something incredibly important. Before Ed could say another word, she shot into the sky like a rocket and disappeared. Ed let out a sigh of relief. He knew he could never defeat Lucy through strength alone. However, there was one tiny detail hidden deep within the game's lore that almost every player ignored. Lucy absolutely hated the dormitory maids. The women who cared for her like loving mothers constantly chased after her to make sure she ate properly and followed a normal schedule. Escaping from them had become part of her daily routine. Satisfied that he had finally solved the problem, Ed returned to his usual work, believing the incident wouldn't have any lasting consequences. Unfortunately, he couldn't have been more wrong. Soon afterward, the Academy announced its next major event, the Joint Combat Training. The training took place inside a massive arena surrounded by spectators. Although it looked like a real tournament, its purpose was simply to allow students to gain combat experience while avoiding serious injuries. To keep everyone safe, only practice weapons were allowed. Mages were restricted to basic elemental spells, while alchemy students were forbidden from using dangerous potions or advanced techniques. The tournament brackets were decided entirely at random. As Ed studied the list of participants, he immediately realized why this event was so important. Every major character in the story would participate: Princess Phinia, the Golden Daughter, Lortel, the Rising Spear Ziggs, the Spirit Mage Janica, the Lazy Genius Lucy, the Ambitious Clavius. Almost every important figure in the game's story would appear here. Still, there was one person Ed cared about more than anyone else: Taylor McLaw, the failed swordsman. Having completed every possible route in the game, from the tragic endings to the true ending, Ed had watched Taylor struggle countless times. Not a single one of his journeys had ever been easy. Without realizing it, Ed had grown attached to him. This time, he genuinely wanted Taylor to succeed. As he waited for the matches to begin, Janica appeared beside him once again. Even after he had shamelessly asked her for money, she continued following him around. "The tournament brackets have been posted," she said cheerfully. Ed shrugged. "I'm not interested." "You aren't curious about your opponent?" Her question caught him off guard. His opponent. Ed suddenly remembered something important. In the original story, Ed Ruth Taylor had already been expelled by this point. He shouldn't even be participating. His expression changed as he looked at the bracket. Damn, his opponent was Fenia. Before his own match, however, Taylor's battle was scheduled first. Ed watched silently as Taylor stepped into the arena and politely declared that he would give it his best. No matter who Taylor faced, Ed intended to watch every second of the fight. Then something unexpected happened. Lucy never appeared. The officials repeatedly called her name, but there was no response. Ed immediately guessed where she was. Walking over to a nearby storage crate, he opened the lid. Sure enough, Lucy was sleeping inside. Without hesitation, Ed grabbed her shoulders and shook her awake. "It's your match." Lucy rubbed her eyes and complained that she was hungry. "Do you have any dried meat? You can eat after the fight." A few moments later, the announcer introduced the competitors, the Academy's strongest first-year student, Lucy Merrill, versus Taylor McLaw, a young man who had never held a sword before entering the Academy. According to the original story, this duel was supposed to become the turning point of Taylor's life. During the battle, Lucy would become careless and accidentally cast a forbidden mid-level spell. As punishment, she would be disqualified. Taylor would earn his first official victory, finally gaining confidence in himself and beginning his journey as a true swordsman. Ed knew this scene by heart. But the battle unfolded differently. The judge gave the signal to begin. Taylor charged forward with brass knuckles instead of a sword. Lucy casually fired a spell. Taylor was blasted backward before he could even get close. The audience stared in disbelief. The fight looked completely one-sided. Still, Taylor refused to stay down. Despite everyone's pity, he slowly stood back up. His entire body trembled, yet he refused to surrender. Ed couldn't help smiling. That was the Taylor he knew. No matter how many times he fell, he always stood back up. Taylor rushed forward once more. This time, even Lucy looked surprised by his speed. Ed waited for the familiar lightning spell. Instead, a sphere of wind suddenly surrounded Lucy. Taylor's attack was completely blocked. Moments later, another powerful gust erupted into a miniature tornado, sending him flying across the arena. He slammed headfirst into a stone pillar before collapsing onto the ground. The referee immediately declared the match over. Lucy Merrill was the winner. Ed froze. This wasn't supposed to happen. The spell Lucy had just used wasn't ordinary wind magic. It was wind's protection, a defensive ability granted only through a contract with a high-ranking wind spirit. In the original timeline, Lucy and Marilda had never formed such a close bond. But because Lucy kept visiting Ed's shelter inside Marilda's forest, their relationship had grown much stronger than it ever should have. Ed's own actions had accidentally changed the future. As Lucy cheerfully asked whether she could finally have some dried meat, Ed ignored her completely and sprinted away. His next opponent was supposed to be Fenia. She even called out to him, but Ed ran straight past her without stopping. Watching him disappear, Fenia stood there in complete confusion. Meanwhile, Ed finally caught up with Taylor. The young swordsman looked completely devastated. His confidence had been shattered. Ed immediately tried to encourage him. "You fought well. Your opponent was simply too strong. Don't let this defeat break you." Deep inside, Ed understood the terrifying truth. If Taylor failed to recover from this loss, his entire future could collapse. The original protagonist's path had already started changing. At the same time, the story revealed the true origin of Princess Fenia's famous ability, inspection. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't a divine blessing. Growing up within the imperial family meant living among endless conspiracies, betrayal, and deception. To survive that ruthless environment, Fenia unconsciously sharpened her instincts until they evolved into an extraordinary ability, capable of detecting lies. She trusted that power more than anyone else. Returning to the arena, Ed finally prepared for his own match. Facing Fenia, he smiled awkwardly. "Please go easy on me." She smiled back. "I intend to." Around them, the audience whispered among themselves. Many students believed Ed had only encouraged Taylor to mock him after his defeat. Others called him cruel and disturbing. Even Fenia briefly wondered if that was true. After all, the old Ed Ruth Taylor had abused his status, manipulated weaker students. Yet, when she remembered the desperate expression on his face while encouraging Taylor, something didn't feel right. Using her inspection ability, she sensed that his concern had been completely genuine. The referee announced the start of the duel. Without hesitation, Fenia launched a powerful water spell directly toward Ed. She already knew he specialized in wind and fire magic. She wanted to see how he would respond. Would he dodge, counterattack, or reveal another hidden trick? Instead, Ed did absolutely nothing. The spell struck him head-on and blasted him clean out of the arena. He never tried to block it, he never attempted to dodge. He didn't even raise his weapon. Lying on the ground, Ed calmly sighed. I lost. Phineas stared at him in disbelief. What are you doing? You didn't even try. The audience erupted with laughter. Some mocked him for being defeated in a single attack. Others loudly cheered for Phineas' effortless victory. Ignoring everyone's reactions, Ed simply smiled politely. Thank you. It was a valuable learning experience. Fenia became even more confused. Nothing about this man made sense. Ever since stepping onto the battlefield, he hadn't looked her in the eyes even once. It was as if the duel itself meant absolutely nothing to him. The referee officially declared Fenia the winner. Before anyone could stop him, Ed stood up and immediately ran out of the arena. There were far more important things to worry about than winning a meaningless match. Right now, changing the future back onto its original path mattered far more than his own pride. Ed knew he had to be extremely careful when dealing with Princess Fenia. She was one of the central characters of the game's story, and any unnecessary interaction with her could cause the timeline to drift even further from its original course. Right now, his biggest priority wasn't the princess. It was Taylor. After everything that had happened during the tournament, Ed had to find him as quickly as possible. As he hurried through the academy's corridors, someone suddenly called out from behind. It was Fenia. She had actually chased after him. Surprised, Ed asked why she was walking around without her royal escort. Fenia ignored the question completely. Instead, she looked him straight in the eyes. Who are you, really? Ed blinked in confusion. What do you mean? Fenia stepped closer. She couldn't understand his behavior during their duel. He had calmly admitted defeat, thanked her for the fight, and claimed he had learned something from it, despite making absolutely no effort to win. Looking back, she realized he had only wanted to leave the arena as quickly as possible. Unable to hold back any longer, all the frustration she had been suppressing suddenly burst out. She complained about everything that had been weighing on her mind. The greedy merchant Lortel was constantly trying to expand her influence over the academy. Professor Glast made every class more exhausting than it needed to be. Even the palace servants never stopped lecturing her about proper royal etiquette and how a princess should behave. Her head was already overflowing with responsibilities, and now there was one more mystery she couldn't solve. Ed Ruth Taylor. She demanded to know who he truly was. For the first time, Ed realized she wasn't acting out of anger alone. She was simply exhausted. Seeing her on the verge of breaking down, he gently placed his hands on her shoulders. Take a deep breath. Fenia looked at him in surprise. Inhale slowly and exhale. Without thinking, she followed his instructions after repeating the breathing exercise a few times. The tension in her body gradually disappeared. She finally calmed down. Then, as the silence settled in, she suddenly realized what had just happened. Her face immediately turned bright red. Completely embarrassed, she covered her face and asked Ed to forget everything she had just said. Ed simply smiled. It's fine. Thinking the conversation was finally over, he prepared to leave. Unfortunately, Fenia still had more questions. She admitted that she had a terrible habit of overthinking everything, because she had spent her entire life surrounded by lies and political schemes inside the imperial palace. She constantly tried to analyze other people's intentions. Meanwhile, Ed could only think about one thing. Please let me go find Taylor. Ignoring his impatience, Fenia continued speaking. She presented her own theory. According to her, Ed had willingly cut ties with his family because he already knew about the darkness hidden within the Ruth Taylor household. She even believed he had deliberately provoked Taylor so that his own family would disown him. Ed carefully considered her words. Ironically, she wasn't entirely wrong. The Ruth Taylor family truly was hiding horrifying secrets. However, this wasn't the right time to reveal any of them. Keeping his expression calm, Ed simply answered, I don't know what you're talking about. Inside his mind, he knew it was still far too early to involve himself in the Empire's political conspiracies. Fenia frowned. That doesn't make sense. She couldn't understand his actions. Why had he encouraged Taylor during the match? Why had he cheered him on so passionately? Had he actually started sympathizing with him? Ed knew he couldn't answer honestly, so he forced himself to lie. I was only making fun of him. He shrugged casually. Everyone already hates me. If I pretend to support Taylor, maybe people will start thinking I'm not so bad. The moment he finished speaking, Fenia stared directly into his eyes. No. She shook her head. That's a lie. Her inspection ability had already exposed him. She demanded that he repeat those words while looking directly at her. Ed stubbornly insisted he was telling the truth. But the more he lied, the more frustrated Fenia became. She couldn't understand why he kept hiding his real intentions. Ed hated doing this. He knew lying to someone who could detect lies was pointless. Still, he believed it was the only way to preserve the original storyline. Finally, Fenia let out a long sigh. I can't do anything. She admitted she had no proof to support her suspicions. Then she quietly stepped aside. I'll let you go. She had noticed him glancing toward the hallway throughout their entire conversation and understood that something important was waiting for him. Ed thanked her politely and started walking away. As he left, he couldn't help reflecting on everything that had just happened. That was the first time he had seen such a vulnerable side of Princess Phinia. As one of the story's central characters, she carried an overwhelming number of responsibilities. Politics, noble expectations, academy life, and countless hidden conspiracies all rested on her shoulders. Ed couldn't help wondering if her emotional outburst had happened because of his interference. Had he already changed the story that much? Just before disappearing around the corner, he stopped and turned back toward her. "There is one thing I'd like to say." Phinia looked up. "My problems are nothing compared to yours." He smiled gently. "It may not be my place to say this, but you look exhausted." For a brief moment, Phinia was left speechless. No one had ever looked past her title as a princess, and simply noticed how tired she truly was. Standing alone in the corridor, she quietly watched Ed disappear, unable to stop thinking about the mysterious man who continued to defy everything she believed she knew. After all, Phinia wasn't just another student. She was a princess, burdened with the responsibilities of the imperial family. Even so, Ed believed that while she was at Sylvania Academy, she deserved at least a little peace. For her entire life, Phinia had devoted herself to seeing through other people's lies. Ironically, this was the first time someone had seen through hers. Ed immediately realized he had already wasted too much time. Taylor was still his top priority. Without another word, he sprinted through the academy corridors, calling out Taylor's name. Before he could find him, however, someone blocked his path. It was Beatrice. She was the main heroine of the game and Taylor's childhood friend. Stepping in front of Ed, she raised her hand to stop him. "Don't come any closer." Her voice was firm. "Ed Ruth Taylor, you've bullied Taylor long enough. Leave him alone." Behind her, Taylor slowly approached. He looked at Ed with caution. "So, you're still attending the academy?" The moment Ed saw him, he noticed something important. Taylor's fighting spirit had returned. While Ed had been occupied with Phinia after the tournament, Beatrice had immediately rushed to comfort Taylor, just as she always did in the original story. She encouraged him, reminded him of his strengths, and assured him that one defeat didn't define him. Now standing before Ed once again, Taylor looked far more composed. "Did you want to say something?" Taylor asked. Ed smiled inwardly. As long as Beatrice remained by Taylor's side, he could fall 100 times and still find the strength to stand up again. Looking directly at him, Ed simply said, "Your swordsmanship is impressive." Taylor frowned. "Is this another joke?" Ed slowly shook his head. "No, I'm serious." After saying those few words, he quietly turned around and walked away. As he left, he finally admitted something to himself. Originally, he had planned to let Taylor save the world while he focused solely on surviving as Ed Ruth Taylor. He was prepared to accept the miserable fate of living as the game's most insignificant villain. But now, none of that mattered. Seeing Taylor regain his determination brought him genuine relief, not because the original storyline had been restored, but because someone he had spent countless hours playing as was finally back on his feet. For Ed, that alone was enough. Taylor and Beatrice silently watched him leave, unable to understand why he seemed so carefree. Ed couldn't blame them. From their perspective, his actions made absolutely no sense. As he continued walking, a tremendous explosion echoed across the academy. A towering pillar of flames shot into the sky. Ed immediately recognized the scene. It had finally begun. This was one of the most unforgettable moments in the entire game. A powerful fire spirit was being summoned. Almost instantly, an enormous wave of ice crashed into the flames. A red-haired girl stepped forward. It was Lortel, the Golden Daughter. Standing opposite her was Janica Failover, the Spirit Sorceress. Lortel's freezing magic temporarily sealed the blazing spirit. For a brief moment, everyone thought she had won. Then, cracks spread across the ice. The imprisoned spirit shattered its frozen prison and erupted with overwhelming force. Ed smiled. Although several events had already changed, this battle still captivated everyone just as it had in the game. The massive flaming dragon continued rampaging while Janica calmly maintained control over the summoned spirit. Even Lortel's incredible magic couldn't suppress it for long. In the end, Janica emerged victorious. Thunderous applause filled the arena. Students surrounded her, celebrating as though she were a famous hero. Meanwhile, Academy medics rushed toward Lortel. She had suffered severe injuries during the battle. Watching the medical staff carry her away, Janica lowered her head. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't celebrating. She only felt guilty for hurting her opponent. Ed quietly reflected on how different everything had become. Originally, Lucy's duel against Taylor was supposed to become the highlight of the joint combat training. Instead, Janica had stolen the spotlight completely. She had become the symbol of Sylvania Academy's strength, protecting the pride of the upperclassmen against the talented newcomers. Although Janica was already surrounded by countless friends, her life was about to become much more complicated. Oddly enough, Ed considered that a good thing. Every time he got too close to one of the story's major characters, another unexpected problem seemed to appear. 2 weeks passed peacefully, During that time, Ed deliberately avoided all of the main characters and focused entirely on surviving. He improved his shelter, crafted a fishing net, and no longer had to worry about finding food. His hard work also paid off in the form of improved stats. His stamina increased to 6. His intellect rose to 5. His willpower reached 8. His luck remained at 6. Looking at his stronger physique, Ed felt satisfied. Still, he knew it was far too early to relax. One morning while training near his shelter, he suddenly heard a familiar voice. Janica had appeared once again. The moment she noticed him without a shirt, her face instantly turned bright red. "Do you always walk around like this?" Ed sighed. "You're the one who keeps coming here." Then he asked the question that had been bothering him for weeks. "What exactly is so interesting about this forest?" Janica smiled innocently. "It feels like a secret fortress." She looked around the shelter with sparkling eyes. "Every time I come here, it's like discovering another adventure." Then her expression became more serious. "I actually wanted to ask your advice. Out of everyone at the academy, why would she ask him?" Janica explained that he had left the arena before the joint combat training ended. Because of that, he hadn't seen everything that happened afterward. She quietly admitted that during her battle with Lortel, she had seriously injured her opponent. Ed remembered the fight. Lortel had violated the rules first by using an intermediate-level spell. Objectively speaking, Janica wasn't entirely responsible, but none of that mattered to her. She couldn't stop blaming herself. "I've tried to forget it," she confessed, "but I can't. I lost control. My friends all tell me it wasn't my fault, but I still don't know whether I should apologize." Ed thought for a moment before answering honestly. "If you truly believe apologizing is the right thing to do, then you should apologize." His answer was simple. It wasn't meant to comfort her. It was simply the truth. Ed looked at Janica thoughtfully. She was cheerful, kind, adorable. Everyone adored her. Whenever she blamed herself, countless friends immediately rushed to reassure her that she had done nothing wrong. But even surrounded by that kindness, her own guilt never disappeared. Perhaps that was exactly why she had come to him instead. Janica smiled gently. "As expected, you never take my side just because everyone else does." Ed became slightly flustered. "I wasn't trying to offend you." She shook her head. "It's the opposite. I actually like that." She explained that ever since the beginning of the semester she had noticed how much he had changed. Even when he desperately needed money, he hadn't begged or acted pitiful. Instead, it almost felt as though he was intentionally telling people not to become involved with him. That version of Ed was completely different from the person everyone described. "I've never met someone who speaks to me the way you do." Her smile grew even warmer. "Being around you makes me feel strangely comfortable." The following day, Ed hurried through the academy corridors with a serious expression. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. The failed swordsman of Sylvania was considered a masterpiece. Yet only a handful of players had ever reached its true ending. Most players encountered one of the many bad endings long before finishing the game. Ed mentally reviewed several of them. In one route, the player rescued a girl during a kobold ambush. Later, during the class ranking examination, that decision exposed one of Lortel's hidden secrets. As a result, assassins were sent to kidnap and kill the player. That was bad ending number 3. In another route, Taylor died during a monster combat training exercise after being assassinated. If the player abandoned his childhood friend Beatrice and chose to support Lortel instead, bad ending number 7 was triggered. Beatrice fell from a cliff because Taylor wasn't there to save her. There was yet another route involving Janica's summoned fire spirit, Tarkin. If the player protected Lortel during that incident, he was burned alive by the spirit's flames. That route also led directly to another tragic bad ending. Remembering all those failed scenarios, Ed couldn't help feeling uneasy. The story had already begun changing, and if those changes continued, he had no idea which ending awaited him anymore. Ed knew he couldn't afford to waste another second. Just as he was about to run off, someone suddenly stepped in front of him. It was Lortel Keslam, the daughter of one of the greatest business families in the Empire. Within the academy, she was known as the Golden Daughter. Among experienced players, however, she was remembered for something entirely different. She was the 4th heroine of the failed swordsman of Sylvania. At the beginning of the game, Lortel appeared to be an ambitious, manipulative villain who cared only about money and influence. Only much later did players discover the painful truth hidden beneath her cold exterior. By the end of her route, many players found themselves divided over whether to support her or Princess Fenia. Seeing her now, Ed immediately tried to walk past without stopping. Getting involved with Lortel was the last thing he wanted. Unfortunately, she had no intention of letting him leave. "I'd like to buy 2 hours of your time." Ed didn't even slow down. Lortel quickly lowered her offer. Then, "Just 1 minute." She stepped in front of him again. "I've been watching you. Even after losing everything, you continue studying and improving yourself. It doesn't matter whether people call you arrogant or strange. I simply want to talk." Then she took out 3 gold coins. "I'll pay you." 3 gold coins. For most people, that was equivalent to an entire month's salary. Ed finally stopped walking. Looking directly at her, he asked, So the Golden Daughter buys relationships with money too? Lortel smiled calmly. Without waiting for permission, she slipped the 3 coins into his inner pocket. Keep them. The more allies you have, the better. Ed immediately understood what was happening. Lortel already knew that a political struggle with Princess Phenia was inevitable. She wasn't simply making friends. She was recruiting allies. Ed slowly removed the coins from his pocket. He reached out his hand instead. Let's just shake hands. Lortel accepted the handshake. As she watched him return the money, she couldn't help thinking about the wealthy people she had seen lose everything. Most of them broke completely. Faced with poverty, they abandoned their pride, their dignity, and sometimes even their own families just to survive. She had expected Ed to become exactly that kind of person. Instead, he quietly gave back enough money to completely change his current life. Without another word, Ed turned around and walked away. Deep down, he knew those coins would have solved countless problems, but accepting them meant becoming entangled with Lortel, Phenia, and Janika all at once. That wasn't survival. That was walking straight toward destruction. That evening, Lortel thought carefully about what had happened. Surprisingly, she didn't feel insulted by Ed's rejection. As a businesswoman, she always evaluated every situation logically. Losing one opportunity simply meant searching for another. Soon afterward, she found Janika walking through one of the academy's hallways. Janika smiled warmly. Your hair looks beautiful today. Lortel greeted her politely before apologizing for everything that had happened during their duel. She explained that she had wanted to apologize much earlier, but never found the opportunity. Janika noticed the bandages covering Lortel's body. You still haven't recovered. Lortel smiled. I'll be fine soon. At first, Lortel assumed Janika was the type of innocent girl who could easily be manipulated. Then Janika suddenly asked, Did you talk with Ed? Lortel froze. Why do you ask? Janika giggled. When something interesting happens, spirits love spreading gossip. She casually explained that the spirits had overheard every conversation that took place in the northern forest, including the one where Lortel tried to persuade Ed to get closer to her. Lortel couldn't hide her surprise. Janika smiled gently. You already know that sincerity can't be bought with money. If you really want to get close to Ed, you'll need something much more genuine. Realizing she had spoken a little too confidently, Janika immediately scratched her cheek in embarrassment. This is actually the first time I've been in a position to lecture someone. Since I'm finally a second-year student, it feels a little awkward. Before leaving, Janika mentioned that she was preparing to form a contract with a high-ranking spirit. Recently, many people had placed their hopes in her. Because of that, she wanted to work even harder. Then she paused. Oh, and I'm sorry about the injuries from our match. I hope you recover soon. With that, she quietly walked away. Watching her disappear, Lortel slowly realized just how badly she had misjudged her. Despite understanding the darkness hidden within the world, Janika had somehow managed to preserve her kindness. As the door closed behind her, Lortel couldn't help smiling. That brief conversation had taught her something valuable. If she wanted people to look at her the way they looked at Janika, she still had a long way to go. Meanwhile, Janika walked away feeling equally motivated. Being surrounded by people who believed in her made her want to become someone worthy of their expectations. At the same time, deep inside the forest, Ed was hanging his freshly washed clothes out to dry. Nearby, Lucy suddenly sniffed the air. Her sleepy expression instantly disappeared. Someone was approaching. A moment later, the bushes parted. Standing there was Belle Maya. She was the head maid of Ophelis Hall, the prestigious dormitory reserved for Sylvania Academy's wealthiest students. She was also the very woman who had personally thrown Ed out of the dormitory along with all of his belongings. Ed instinctively tried to explain himself. Before he could finish, Belle Maya smiled softly. I already know everything. She admitted that Janika talked about him constantly. However, she had never imagined he was living under such miserable conditions. Even so, she was genuinely happy that he had continued moving forward instead of giving up. Ed looked around his tiny shelter. He honestly couldn't understand what part of his current situation qualified as improving. Belle Maya's calm voice somehow carried incredible authority. It felt powerful enough that even someone unable to hear could understand every word she said. The story then explained why. The maids of Ophelis Hall were considered an elite group. They handled every aspect of the students' daily lives, from cleaning and laundry to preparing meals worthy of the empire's highest-ranking nobles. The basket Belle Maya carried was undoubtedly filled with ingredients that ordinary people would never even have the chance to taste. Ed realized this was exactly the kind of information that never appeared anywhere in the game. As he observed her, another thought crossed his mind. Unlike the Academy's major characters, Belle Maya wasn't directly involved in the main storyline. Perhaps interacting with her wouldn't cause the timeline to change. Belle Maya noticed how formal he was acting and smiled again. You don't need to be so polite. We're outside the dormitory now. You can speak normally. Ed respectfully shook his head. I can't. You work harder than almost anyone else. Then his eyes drifted toward the basket she was carrying. Unable to hide his curiosity, he asked, What exactly do you have in there? For the first time since arriving in this world, Ed began thinking that perhaps there was someone outside the game's main cast with whom he could become genuine friends without risking the future. As the days passed, Ed's survival skills continued improving at an incredible pace. The system constantly rewarded his hard work. After gathering various fruits, mushrooms, and medicinal herbs throughout the forest, he unlocked new crafting knowledge related to cooking and survival. He built a proper meat drying rack to preserve food for longer periods and upgraded his fishing equipment with a much larger net, making hunting far more efficient. While heating water with his fire magic to prepare a cup of herbal tea, another system notification appeared. Both fire magic and windblade had reached level 10. Although he only knew 2 basic spells, he had used them so frequently for everyday tasks that they had reached an exceptionally high level. Simple activities like cooking meals, boiling water, and preparing firewood had steadily increased both his survival skills and his magic proficiency. By the time he finished preparing everything, the sun hadn't even set. Looking around his campsite, Ed couldn't help smiling. Without realizing it, he had become far more capable than when he first arrived. For the first time since entering this world, he was actually enjoying himself. Suddenly, a strange shadow appeared overhead. Before he could react, something crashed directly into his campsite. The impact sent him flying across the clearing. Ed immediately panicked. His carefully built camp, his precious shelter, it had been completely destroyed. When the dust finally settled, he looked toward the crater. Lying in the middle of the wreckage was Lucy, still wearing her pajamas. She slowly sat up, rubbing her head. "I almost died." Ed stared at her in disbelief. "What could possibly have almost killed you?" Lucy answered with a completely straight face. "Bel Maya." Ed blinked. "What?" Lucy explained that she had skipped class again, just like always. Unfortunately, Bel Maya had been in an unusually bad mood that day. Instead of her usual gentle lecture, she had chased Lucy with a clenched fist. The attack happened so quickly that Lucy instinctively teleported away, landing directly on top of Ed's campsite. According to Lucy, the punch looked far more painful than the landing itself. Ed could only sigh. So it really was Miss Bel Maya. Looking closer, he noticed a tree branch tangled in Lucy's hair. Then he glanced around at the remains of his camp. "So you destroyed my entire house." Lucy quietly rubbed the bump on her head. For once, she actually looked hurt. Ed found that strange. Normally, she was always protected by powerful defensive magic. Lucy explained that she had completely exhausted her mana during the emergency teleport. Realizing she had no magical energy left, Ed slowly raised his hand. "This is for my ruined camp." He flicked it again and again. Lucy quietly accepted every hit without resisting. After calming down, Ed looked at the destroyed shelter and reached an important conclusion. A flimsy campsite made from branches simply wasn't enough anymore. Next time, he would build a real house, one made from proper lumber. A sturdy home capable of surviving disasters like this. To prepare, Ed visited the academy library. His schedule had become incredibly busy, so he made full use of every opportunity to learn new skills. This time, he borrowed books about architecture, construction materials, and woodworking techniques. As he studied, he carefully planned how to smooth wooden beams and design a roof sturdy enough to withstand harsh weather. Completely absorbed in his work, he lost track of time. Eventually, someone approached his table. "The library is closing." Ed looked up in surprise. Standing before him was a young girl. She smiled warmly. "You really work hard." Embarrassed, Ed quickly apologized for staying so late. The girl simply shook her head. "It's fine. Watching you study motivates me to work harder too." She politely introduced herself. "My name is Elka Islan. I'm a first-year student in the College of Magic." Ed noticed she was waiting expectantly for him to introduce himself as well. "I'm Ed Ruth Taylor." The moment she heard his name, her eyes widened. Ed sighed inwardly. He had already become accustomed to people's shocked reactions. After all, the original Ed's reputation had been absolutely terrible. To his surprise, however, Elka smiled. "You're nothing like the rumors." She explained that over the past several days she had repeatedly seen him reading one technical book after another. He had already finished 6 specialized books in a row. Everyone claimed he was arrogant, lazy, and aimless. Yet the person sitting before her was hardworking, sincere, and constantly trying to improve himself. "I don't think those rumors are very trustworthy anymore." She smiled brightly. "Honestly, I'm rooting for you." Ed couldn't help feeling surprised. He quietly thanked her for the encouragement. As they prepared to leave, Elka explained that she would stay behind to help clean the library. She wished him a safe trip home. Just then, the entire building suddenly shook violently. Shelves rattled, books crashed onto the floor. The ground trembled as though an enormous earthquake had struck the academy. Ed's eyes widened. One of the towering bookshelves tipped toward Elka. At the same time, outside the academy, an enormous pillar of magical light pierced the night sky. It looked as though the world itself was ending. Ed immediately recognized the scene. This was the final chapter of Episode 1, the confrontation with Glaskin. Meanwhile, it was already 11:30 at night. Inside the Academy's Student Center, a temporary evacuation camp had been established. Thanks to Taylor and his companions, many students had successfully gathered inside the protective barrier. Nearly 2 hours had passed since the disaster began. Looking toward the glowing sky, Beatrice suddenly remembered something she had once read in a book about spirit magic. That's a summoning rune. Her voice trembled. It belongs to Glaskin, the greatest of the dark spirits. Hearing those words, Fenia's expression immediately darkened. If that's true, then the only person capable of forming such a powerful spiritual connection would be Janica Failover. Silence filled the room. Taylor finally stepped forward. This is bad, but standing here worrying won't solve anything. He explained that if Beatrice was correct, the barrier protecting them was only delaying the inevitable. Once Glaskin fully manifested, countless students would lose their lives. Taylor immediately ordered everyone to gather inside the student center. Some students argued that anyone outside the barrier would surely notice the disaster. Sooner or later, the academy professors or even the Imperial Guard would arrive to rescue them. However, an alchemy student disagreed. If Glaskin truly was a high-ranking dark spirit, then the barrier surrounding the academy had to be unbelievably powerful. Outside reinforcements might never reach them in time. With the headmaster currently away from the academy, they would have to solve the crisis themselves. She suggested that if everyone combined their strength, they might still have a chance. Before anyone could agree, Clavius immediately objected. His face had turned pale. This is suicide. He pointed out that they would first have to defeat countless mid-level spirits before even reaching Janica. Even then, they would still have to face multiple high-ranking spirits. Among them were Tarkin, the great fire spirit, and the terrifying dark spirit, Velosphere. There is no way I'm joining that. Lortel quietly frowned. She couldn't believe Janica possessed enough power to summon Glaskin while simultaneously controlling so many powerful spirits. Another student explained that most of the power likely belonged to Velosphere. Janica herself was merely acting as a conduit. Dark spirits naturally preyed upon spirit mages. The stronger the mage, the more attractive they became to such entities. Because Janica possessed extraordinary talent, Velosphere had chosen her as the perfect vessel for its summoning. Before the discussion could continue, another student interrupted. It doesn't matter how this happened. What matters is what we're going to do now. Everyone instinctively turned toward Princess Fenia. The room fell silent. They waited for their leader to make the decision. For a brief moment, Fenia remembered something Ed had once told her. He had said that life at Sylvania Academy didn't have to be so heavy, that she didn't need to shoulder every burden alone. A faint smile crossed her face. If only things were truly that simple. Taking a deep breath, Fenia finally made her decision. We move out in 1 hour. Only she, her royal guard Claire, and the highest-ranked students from each class would participate in the operation. They were the only ones strong enough to confront the spirits directly. She looked around at everyone gathered inside the student center. Prepare yourselves. I'll take full responsibility for everything that happens from here. Just as everyone was preparing to move out, another student rushed into the student center with an urgent report. After inspecting the academy, they had confirmed that the faculty members were unable to assist. The dormitories and the potion archive had both suffered critical damage, leaving the staff occupied with rescue efforts. Fenia quickly understood the situation. At that moment, only the students gathered there were capable of taking action. Before anyone could respond, another girl came running in. There are still people trapped inside the library, she explained that one of them was her close friend, Elka Islan, while the other was a second-year student. Hearing Elka's name, one of the students immediately panicked. Elka is still inside? The girl nodded. Elka had become a library apprentice to study advanced grimoires, but unlike the academy's stronger students, she had almost no ability to defend herself. We have to save her immediately. Lortel stepped forward and tried to calm everyone. The library is too far away. Our priority has to be stopping Janica. Fenia silently agreed. Then she remembered one important detail. The girl had mentioned there was another second-year student trapped alongside Elka. Fenia took a deep breath. We'll have to trust that student. He'll protect her until we arrive. Ziggs wasn't convinced. Still, he reluctantly accepted her decision. Fenia turned back toward the girl. Are you absolutely certain someone else is with Elka? The girl hesitated. Seeing her reaction, Ziggs narrowed his eyes. What are you hiding? After gathering her courage, she finally answered. The other student is Edruth Taylor. The atmosphere instantly changed. Several students began whispering among themselves. Even Ziggs' expression darkened. The girl hurriedly explained that Ed had simply been studying late in the library. She admitted she had felt uncomfortable around him because of his terrible reputation, so she had left before the disaster began, unintentionally leaving Elka behind. Although Elka ignored the academy's rumors, everyone else knew exactly what kind of person Edruth Taylor was supposed to be. The room filled with murmurs. That loser, he's the one trapped in there, as shameless as always. Ziggs clenched his fists in anger. Before he could move, however, Fenia stopped him. For a brief moment, she remembered everything that had happened since meeting Ed. Then she calmly spoke. Perhaps it's time we put a little faith in him. Nobody responded. No one there truly trusted Ed. Without saying another word, Zig suddenly disappeared. Using incredible speed, he charged toward the library. The hostile spirits blocking his path were sliced apart one after another. As he ran, he made a silent promise. If Ed had harmed Elka, he would never forgive him. The story then shifted to Zig's past. Calling his life a journey from rags to riches wasn't enough to describe the miracle he had experienced. Long before entering Sylvania Academy, Ziggs had lived on the Empire's northern plains. Those lands were beyond the Empire's control. There were no laws, no protection. Every single day ended with one simple question: would you still be alive tomorrow? Born into a nomadic tribe, Ziggs was abandoned when he came of age. Without realizing it, his own family had left him behind. To survive, he learned how to hunt long before he ever learned how to read. Before earning money, he survived by scavenging supplies from corpses abandoned along the roadside. One day, while dragging the body of a dead traveler through town, a young girl suddenly stopped him. "What is your name?" "Jay." The girl quietly smiled. "You look just like a wolf walking on two legs." Those simple words changed everything. For the first time, Ziggs realized what his life had become. He wasn't simply surviving. He was nothing more than a lonely wolf cub abandoned by his own pack. Unable to hold back his emotions, he burst into tears. That same girl, Elka, together with her father, she welcomed him into their home without asking for anything in return. For the first time in his life, Ziggs experienced genuine kindness. The lonely wolf gradually became a man. Now, to protect the person who had once saved him, he was willing to become a beast once again. Slashing through every spirit that stood in his way, Ziggs sprinted toward the library. Along the way, he remembered every rumor he had heard about Ed Ruth Taylor. People claimed he was a bully, a liar, someone who insulted princesses and constantly tormented weaker students. By the time he reached the library, his anger had reached its limit. Inside, he found Ed sitting against a wall, covered in injuries. "Where's Elka?" Ed looked up calmly. "Third floor, the reading room." Without another word, Ziggs shoved Ed aside and rushed upstairs. Throwing open the door, he froze. Elka was sleeping peacefully. Someone had carefully covered her with a jacket. Relief washed over him. Then he noticed something strange. Several bookshelves had been deliberately repositioned around her, forming a protective barrier. The curtains had been tightly closed to keep wandering spirits from entering the room. Beside her lay a handwritten note. It calmly instructed Elka not to panic after waking up. If the danger had already passed, she should leave immediately. If she encountered any spirits, she should run without looking back. Only then did Ziggs notice the bloodstains covering the jacket wrapped around her. His heart sank. The blood wasn't Elka's. Looking around the room, every clue pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone had protected her without worrying about their own safety. That person was Ed Ruth Taylor. Ziggs slowly lowered his head. Why would someone with such a terrible reputation risk his own life to save another student? Meanwhile, downstairs, Ed quietly thought to himself, "I was so close." The story then rewound to reveal what had happened 3 hours earlier. When the earthquake first struck, Elka had already lost consciousness. Without hesitation, Ed threw himself forward and caught the massive bookshelf before it crushed her. As he struggled to hold its enormous weight, he couldn't help appreciating all the physical training he had endured over the past several weeks. Even so, he immediately realized something was wrong. Everything was happening much earlier than it should have. Looking outside, he saw the gigantic summoning rune burning across the night sky. The confrontation with Glaskin had already begun. Without wasting another second, Ed closed every curtain inside the library. Taylor would handle the main battle. Ed had no intention of interfering with an event involving so many important characters. As far as he was concerned, the future still wasn't something he should try to change. His priority was survival. Knowing that low-level spirits would soon flood the academy, Ed hurriedly began transforming the library into a temporary fortress. He dragged heavy bookshelves across the floor, blocked every entrance, and reinforced every possible access point. Compared to his tiny forest shelter, the library was a far better place to survive the coming disaster. While working, another thought suddenly crossed his mind. Janika's greatest strength wasn't simply her magical power, it was her deep understanding of spirits and the extraordinary bond she shared with them. The more a spirit mage communicated with spirits, the stronger that connection became. Unfortunately, someone like Ed possessed almost no spiritual talent. He could barely see spirits at all. Under normal circumstances, improving those abilities would have been nearly impossible. Then, Ed suddenly stopped moving. Something had changed. Slowly lifting his head, he stared into the empty air. For the first time, he could actually see the spirits surrounding him. Janika had summoned countless spirits right in front of Ed. Although the sight irritated him, he silently thanked them for the opportunity and immediately unleashed his windblade. One after another, the spirits were sliced apart until the entire group had been wiped out. Only after the battle ended did Ed realize how quickly everything had happened. By defeating the spirits, both his spiritual understanding and spiritual connection had risen to level 7. He was getting closer to his goal. If both attributes reached level 15, he would finally be able to form a contract with a spirit. Completely exhausted, Ed struggled to catch his breath. At that moment, Ziggs appeared carrying Elka in his arms and asked why Ed was still there. Ed was completely confused. In his mind, he wondered what Ziggs meant. Couldn't he see that he was utterly drained? Even so, Ed simply answered that he had been training. Ziggs didn't believe that explanation for a second. He thought only a fool would accept such an excuse, but instead of questioning him, he nodded. At that moment, he felt he finally understood what kind of person Ed really was. Ziggs respectfully bowed his head. "Senior Ed, I owe you a great debt. One day I'll repay this favor." Hearing those words, Ed suddenly remembered something obvious. Elka was the love of Ziggs' life. She meant everything to him. How had he forgotten such an important detail? Ziggs was also Taylor's closest friend in the original story, a character whose role was vital to the main plot. After analyzing the situation, Ed realized Ziggs had probably rushed over from the student center. Now that he knew Elka was safe, he needed to return immediately. Ed also understood that he wasn't supposed to be involved in this part of the story. Without wasting another second, he told Ziggs to go help Taylor. Ziggs looked surprised. "You mean Taylor McClaw? Why are you speaking so highly of him? You two barely even know each other." Ed explained that Taylor was the only one capable of injuring Tarkin because he would soon learn the elemental slash. That technique was essential for defeating the monster. If Taylor mastered it in time, they could still win. Ziggs thanked him for the advice, but Ed cut him off before he could continue. "There isn't time. Just go." Once Ziggs left, Ed collapsed onto the ground again, completely drained. As he rested, a troubling thought crossed his mind. Had he interfered with the story again? Then another realization struck him. He remembered that Ziggs and Taylor weren't actually friends yet. In the original story, during the end-of-semester evaluation in Act 1, the two had fought each other. Taylor had been completely overwhelmed, but during that battle he awakened the elemental slash and used it to break through Ziggs' magic. That determination earned Ziggs' respect, and the two became close friends. The problem was that event should have happened an entire month ago. Because of all the changes Ed had caused, that duel never happened. As a result, Ziggs and Taylor were still strangers. Without their friendship, Taylor had never learned the elemental slash. Without the elemental slash, nobody could injure Tarkin. Ed finally understood the terrifying truth. Without realizing it, he had completely shattered the original storyline. Later, back at the temporary headquarters, Ziggs finally arrived and apologized for being late, saying he was ready to fight. "Forget it. Even if you had been here from the beginning, we still would have failed." Their first assault had ended in complete defeat. One of the knights admitted they desperately needed reinforcements because nobody could even get past Tarkin. Everyone looked toward Phinia, placing the burden of leadership on her shoulders. She quietly reflected that they were fortunate everyone had survived, even though Claire had been left behind and Clavius had suffered serious injuries. Despite everything, Phinia calmly declared that they still had to find a way to remove Tarkin from their path. Suddenly, someone interrupted. "We don't have time for that." Everyone turned around in shock. "If we waste time defeating every spirit, the ritual will be completed. We have to head straight for Tarkin." Phinia froze. The person speaking was Ed Roth Taylor. Although he didn't want to interfere any further, Ed had finally accepted that he had no choice. From this point onward, he would have to step directly into the game's main storyline. Everyone stared at him in disbelief. Clavius even thought it had to be some kind of joke. However, Ziggs stopped everyone. "Let's hear him out." Ed quickly explained his strategy. Their first objective wasn't to defeat Tarkin, it was to get past him and reach Velasfair, who had possessed Janica. Everyone already knew Tarkin's scales made him nearly immune to ordinary attacks, so wasting time trying to kill him was pointless. Instead, they would divide into two groups. One team would distract Tarkin, the second team would slip past him and confront Velasfair directly. Lortel immediately rejected the idea. "The last time we escaped was pure luck. If both Tarkin and Velasfair notice the same group, every one of us will die." Ed calmly answered that risks could only be judged by comparing them with another plan. Their true objective wasn't Tarkin. It was Janica. If they defeated Janica, Tarkin would disappear along with her. Ziggs then asked the obvious question, "So who's going to be the bait?" Another student laughed bitterly. "So, who's volunteering to commit suicide?" Taylor immediately raised his hand. "I'll do it." Ed instantly refused. "No, you're part of the combat team." Taylor argued that he was fast enough to survive, but Ed shook his head. "You're completely misunderstanding the situation." He explained that the two teams didn't need equal numbers. A smaller bait team would be enough. He, Clavius, and Lortel would distract Tarkin. Clavius immediately protested, "I don't want to die." Lortel also politely declined the assignment. The entire group began arguing. Ed sighed. There was no longer time for debate. Finally, Phinia stepped forward. "I don't fully understand your plan, but I believe you're telling the truth." As the third princess of Cloel, she officially divided the teams. Taylor, Ziggs, Alvira, and Aelia would infiltrate the training grounds and stop Janica. Ed, Clavius, and Lortel would serve as the bait team and keep Tarkin occupied. Before everyone departed, Phinia gave them one final order: don't die. With that, the operation began. Inside the corridor leading to the nail hall, Lortel asked Ed how he planned to distract a gigantic fire dragon. Ed simply replied that she only needed to follow his instructions. If everything goes according to plan, we'll win. The three of them rushed directly toward Tarkin. Ed reassured Clavius not to panic. Although Clavius was famous for being cowardly and lacking confidence, he was actually the strongest first-year student in the combat department when it came to close-range fighting. Ed knew exactly how capable he really was. Clavius, however, couldn't understand why Ed sounded so confident. As they approached, Tarkin immediately sensed their presence. Behind the massive creature lay the training grounds where Janica was performing the ritual. Remembering Phinia's encouragement, Clavius tried to gather his courage. He clenched his fists and prepared himself. Then he witnessed Tarkin's overwhelming power firsthand. His confidence instantly disappeared. The battle's starting, but how are we supposed to distract something like that? When he turned around to ask Ed, he suddenly froze. Both Ed and Lortel were gone. Even Tarkin looked momentarily confused. The next second, the giant dragon charged straight toward Clavius. Terrified, he screamed and ran for his life while shouting that he'd been tricked. He cursed everyone, declared he hated the entire world, and sprinted through the hallway with Tarkin chasing right behind him. Meanwhile, Lortel stood safely outside the corridor, letting out a quiet sigh. Earlier, while Clavius had been psyching himself up, Ed had secretly instructed Lortel to leave. The real plan had always been to lure both Clavius and Tarkin deep into the hallway. The plan worked perfectly. Lortel looked at Ed and asked whether Clavius had truly been chosen as the sacrifice. Ed calmly shook his head. It isn't a sacrifice. He's the strongest student in his class. He'll survive. Then he reminded her that there was something far more important she needed to do. Standing outside the training grounds, Lortel closed her eyes and began gathering an enormous amount of magical energy. Ed explained that Lortel's role was simple but crucial. She had to create an opening for the other group. He told her not to believe the rumors surrounding him. He knew everyone doubted him, but he was certain she was the perfect person for this job. Without hesitation, Lortel gathered her mana and unleashed several massive ice crystals. They slammed into the wall with tremendous force, blasting open a huge passage. The path is open. Hurry, she shouted. As she watched the others rush through the opening, she couldn't help but think how ridiculous the situation was. During what was supposed to be a joint training exercise, she was demolishing entire walls with intermediate-level magic. That was exactly why Ed had entrusted this task to her. For a brief moment, Lortel smiled. Ed Roth Taylor truly was someone who inspired others. Now that the escape route had been secured, only one task remained. She looked toward Clavius, who was still running for his life while loudly cursing both Ed and Lortel. Ignoring his complaints, Lortel remembered every instruction Ed had given her and quietly prepared her next spell. Just then, Tarkin caught up to Clavius. Meanwhile, Ed calmly analyzed the situation. Tarkin remained at that location for one reason. He was the guardian of the training grounds and would never willingly abandon his post. If he couldn't be lured away, then he simply had to be trapped. Thanks to his nearly indestructible scales, direct attacks were useless. Lortel reminded Ed that she had already fought Tarkin once during training. No matter what anyone tried, nobody had managed to leave even a scratch on the monster. Instead of arguing, Ed simply revealed a special item. This will deal with the scales. At the same time, he sprinted through another corridor. Lortel wasn't wrong. Nobody could truly overcome Tarkin's scales through brute force alone. Right then, Lortel slammed both hands onto the ground. An enormous wall of solid ice erupted from the floor, completely blocking Tarkin's path. The monster roared before smashing through the frozen barrier with overwhelming strength. Just as Tarkin burst through, Ed kicked open a nearby door and disappeared inside. He knew exactly where he was going. He had memorized the Academy's map long ago and had taken this route countless times in the game. Behind a hidden entrance, Lucy was exactly where he expected. She was peacefully sleeping. Ed sighed in disbelief. How could someone be taking a nap in the middle of such complete chaos? Then he remembered Lucy had lost her usual shelter after it was destroyed. With nowhere else to rest, she had climbed onto the rooftop, her favorite place to sleep. To be more precise, she had remained asleep because, in the original story, she had been completely removed from this chapter. Janica's unstable condition had angered Belmaya, forcing Lucy to run away and hide. The developers had probably excluded her simply because she was too powerful. Suddenly, Lucy's nose twitched. "I smell dried meat." Ed immediately pulled out an entire bag of jerky, stuffed it into her mouth, and told her she could have all of it. Then he carried her onto the balcony. Looking into the distance, he took a deep breath. This should work. Without another thought, Ed threw Lucy through the air like a character from Angry Birds. At the exact moment Tarkin was about to kill both Clavius and Lortel, Lucy screamed in outrage. "Ed, you're the worst!" The next instant, her magic activated. Divine punishment. An overwhelming storm of lightning erupted from her body, creating a gigantic explosion that engulfed everything nearby. The blast was so devastating that Lortel immediately erected a protective barrier around herself and Clavius. Even Ed was nearly blown away by the shockwave. As he watched the lightning consume Tarkin, he realized this was the turning point. Tarkin was an extremely high-level fire spirit. His scales had been so durable that even an entire squad couldn't harm him. But Lucy's divine punishment completely shattered that defense. Now, Tarkin could finally be injured, and the person who would finish him would be Ed himself. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, the original story continued. Janica remembered her mother's gentle voice telling her she was proud of her. But everyone else who had praised her talents had only wanted to exploit her abilities. Their betrayal shattered the image of kindness and love she had once believed in. A massive explosion echoed throughout the area, but the strike team had already reached her. Bound by countless shadows, Janica forced herself to smile despite everything. Behind her, Velisfair quietly gathered enormous magical power, preparing to erase everyone before him. Elsewhere, Ed continued running. He could feel that terrifying energy growing stronger. Dawn was approaching. The scenario was reaching its conclusion. Fortunately, he wasn't too late. Tarkin was still chasing Clavius. Ed immediately asked where Lucy had gone. Lortel shrugged. She's probably rolling around asleep somewhere. Lucy had already exhausted herself and wouldn't be able to finish the battle. Ed nodded. Then we'll do it. Lortel admitted she had already spent most of her mana opening the passage for the others. Ed didn't hesitate. We only need one clean strike to his neck. He knew her ice magic lacked the precision needed for such an attack, so he would handle it himself. Lortel suggested letting Clavius finish the monster with his sword instead. However, they both knew he wouldn't make it in time. Ed stepped forward. I'll take responsibility. I'm betting my life on the support you can give me. Lortel smiled faintly. That's easy to say. In reality, this is nothing but a gamble. Ed calmly shook his head. No, this isn't a gamble. It's an investment. Those words immediately caught Lortel's attention. Investments were her specialty. Smiling warmly, she admitted that she liked Ed far more than the princess. After all, he had risked his own life for her. Now, she would do the same. Gathering every remaining ounce of mana, Lortel created countless floating ice crystals. A new spell slowly took shape. Ed inhaled deeply. Here I go. Nearby, Clavius was barely standing. His entire body was covered with cuts and bruises from running nonstop, yet he continued watching the battle unfold. Without hesitation, Ed charged directly toward Tarkin. The giant fire spirit immediately prepared its flames to incinerate him. Ed ignored the danger. He only needed to get a little closer. Suddenly, Clavius shouted. A gigantic demonic hand descended from the sky. Ed recognized it instantly. Glaskin's right hand. This was the exact moment when Taylor was supposed to save everyone. The timing couldn't have been worse. Ed still had to finish Tarkin first. Just as Tarkin reached out to burn him alive, a gigantic ice crystal slammed into the monster. Lortel had timed her attack perfectly. Ed never doubted her. He knew she wouldn't make a mistake at the most critical moment. Tarkin tried to recover. It was already too late. Ed closed the remaining distance in an instant. He had cast the spell thousands of times throughout the game. There was no chance he would miss now. Windblade activated. With one flawless slash, Tarkin's head was severed from its body. The system immediately acknowledged the victory. Tarkin had been defeated. Ed's spiritual understanding and spiritual connection increased dramatically. At last he had reached the requirements to form a contract with the spirit. Looking into the distance, Ed saw Taylor making his own move. Taylor shot through the sky like a falling meteor. A brilliant flash illuminated the battlefield. Glaskin's right hand exploded into countless fragments. As Taylor slowly descended, his hair had turned completely white. Watching him, Ed couldn't help but smile. That really was the protagonist. For some reason, he felt as though they shared a strange connection. With both enemies defeated, the massive dome of dark magic surrounding the battlefield finally shattered. As dawn arrived, peace returned to the academy. Later, everyone rested beneath a large tree. Lucy, of course, was sleeping peacefully again. Lortel looked up at the bright morning sky. I've met many people willing to risk their lives, but most of them were cowards. Ed looked at her with complete indifference. So what? Lortel blinked in surprise. So what? We just survived a life-and-death battle together, Senior. Your little heart is seriously lacking emotion. She then formally introduced herself. My name is Lortel Ketchelm. Ed accepted her handshake. As their hands met, he noticed 3 gold coins hidden in her palm. Lortel smiled mischievously. I finally caught you off guard. I still owe you a favor. See you next time, Senior. She walked away, leaving Ed completely confused. He honestly didn't want to become any more involved with someone like her. Soon afterward, another familiar face approached. Taylor activated his swordsmanship before bowing respectfully. You saved my life. Thank you. Before Ed could answer, Clavius shouted from the background, Why is everyone thanking him? I almost died because of that guy. The entire group immediately told Clavius to be quiet. He could only stand there crying while everyone ignored him. Phinia then stepped forward. Ed Roth Taylor, you've done a great deal for everyone today. I can personally recommend you to the student council. Ed politely declined. There won't be any need. He knew the real heroes were Lucy, who had broken Tarkin's defenses, and Taylor, who had destroyed Glaskin's right hand. They deserved the recognition, not him. One of the alchemists laughed. You're being far too modest. Everyone knows how much you've done. Just then, Ziggs reminded everyone to show proper respect toward Elvira, since she was their senior. As Ed quietly watched the group interacting, a warm feeling filled his heart. Until now, he had deliberately kept his distance from all of them because he didn't want to interfere with the original story. But seeing everyone together, he couldn't help smiling. He had watched every one of them struggle, grow stronger, and overcome impossible challenges. Taylor would become the greatest hero. Aelia would continue growing alongside him. Phinia would establish herself as a true ruler. Ziggs would finally find his place among people. Clavius would slowly gain the confidence he had always lacked. Elvira would learn that life wasn't only about having fun. And Lortel, who had spent her entire life chasing wealth, would eventually discover that her own life was worth more than all the gold in the world. Every one of them had a role to play. Every one of them had a future waiting ahead. Ed knew that better than anyone, and that was exactly why he had always tried to stay away from them. Later, Ed returned to the ruined training area. After clearing away the rubble, he forced open the entrance and made his way toward the old arena. Hidden inside was a small cabinet. Ed stopped in front of it. There was still one thing missing. One person he had to find. Someone whose future would become essential. As he slowly opened the cabinet door, he found Janica curled up inside. Looking at her, Ed remembered that Janica's role in the story had always been to remain behind the scenes after this incident. His mind drifted back to a conversation he once had with Lortel. Curious about how someone as talented as Janica had fallen so far, he had asked for her opinion. Lortel had told him about something she witnessed one night. Around midnight, she had entered Janica's dormitory room. Everything inside reflected Janica's sincere personality. Her large desk was completely buried beneath countless gifts. There wasn't even enough room to open a single book. Every wall was covered with dozens of handwritten sticky notes from people thanking her. The obvious solution was simple. She could have stored the presents somewhere else and removed the notes from the walls, but she never did. Janica had become obsessed with repaying every act of kindness she received. Whenever someone showed her gratitude, she felt obligated to return it with even greater sincerity. Day after day, she pushed herself harder and harder, believing she had to live up to everyone's expectations. Ed knew that was exactly what destroyed her. Valus Fair hadn't created her weakness. He had simply taken advantage of it. Janica's emotional collapse had been inevitable. The only strange part was the timing. Everything had happened an entire month earlier than it should have. In the original story, Taylor was supposed to defeat the enemy and become the hero of the event. Instead, he lost. Because of that, Janica unexpectedly became the center of attention, earning admiration and countless new friends. Taylor's defeat had happened because Lucy formed a contract with the high-level wind spirit, Marilda. Lucy only managed to make that contract because she frequently visited the northern forest. Ironically, the peaceful napping spot Ed had unknowingly created for her was what allowed that encounter to happen. But someone had to pay the price for all those changes. That person was Janica. Inside the cabinet, Janica let out a small laugh. I understand now why Lucy likes sleeping here. It's really comfortable. She admitted she never expected Ed to find her, especially while everyone outside was still dealing with the aftermath of the disaster. After everything that had happened, she simply hid herself away. She waited, hoping someone would come looking for her. But nobody did. Eventually, she accepted it. I think I'd like to stay hidden a little longer. Ed quietly asked why. She lowered her head. Because I've been acting like such a crybaby. Ed looked at her silently. At that moment, he remembered the message the wolf spirit had given him. No matter what happened, save Janica. Ed believed he was the only person who knew the future. Perhaps the spirit knew it as well. While everyone else blamed Janica or expected something from her, Ed had deliberately kept his distance. The truth was, Janica had always been someone worthy of trust. Yet her story still ended in tragedy. She desperately tried to form a contract with a high-ranking spirit, but because she rushed the summoning ritual, a dark spirit took advantage of the opening. The academy was destroyed. Her future collapsed. Every single night she stayed awake studying magic. She always smiled at her teachers. She smiled at her friends. She smiled at anyone who showed her kindness. To everyone around her, she looked like the perfect student. No one realized how much she was suffering alone. Perhaps that was why her failure felt so heartbreaking. She had tried harder than anyone else. Ed gently smiled. There really isn't anyone who worked harder than you. Those simple words finally broke the wall surrounding her heart. Tears streamed down Janica's face. For the first time, someone acknowledged her efforts instead of her failures. Ed quietly reflected on the strange contrast of the story. On the grand stage stood the heroes, proudly receiving everyone's praise. Behind the curtain, everything was silent. The first act's villain quietly left the stage just as the true protagonist stepped into the spotlight. Ed had watched this chapter countless times while playing the game, yet only now did he truly understand how beautiful it really was. As he looked around, something changed. Before, he had never been able to see them. Now, dozens of spirits surrounded Janica. At that very moment, Ed finally understood how this story would eventually end. His spiritual understanding and spiritual connection both reached level 10. The system immediately displayed a new notification. Every spirit present had become interested in him. Among them, the high-level wind spirit Marilda showed an especially strong interest. 10 days later, Janica stood before the Academy's disciplinary committee. She admitted every mistake she had made and calmly accepted whatever punishment awaited her. During the first meeting, the Academy attempted to expel her. However, both students and teachers stood up in her defense. They refused to abandon her. At the second hearing, Phinia personally testified that Janica had been completely possessed by Valisfair. Because of that, she could not be held responsible for attempted regicide. Lortel also spoke during the proceedings. Representing the Alte Merchant Association, she announced that the organization would cover every expense required to repair the academy. They asked for nothing in return. Well, almost nothing. The agreement included one small condition. The academy would reduce customs fees on educational supplies and future trade deals. After all the discussions, Janica still received several punishments. She lost every privilege given to the academy's top students. Her awards and honors were revoked. She also lost the right to stay in the dormitory during the following semester. However, 20 days later, the harshest punishment of all was officially cancelled. Her expulsion was revoked. The entire academy celebrated. Everyone felt as though justice had finally prevailed. To welcome Janica back, her friends prepared a beautiful afternoon tea. Before she arrived, one of them reminded everyone not to mention the Glaskin incident. They didn't want Janica to relive those painful memories. When everything was ready, they welcomed her with warm smiles. The atmosphere quickly became cheerful. Then, out of nowhere, Janica asked an unexpected question. What's the difference between liking someone and loving someone? Her friends exchanged puzzled looks. Why would she suddenly ask something like that? Trying to hide her embarrassment, Janica explained that she was asking for a friend. Of course, nobody believed that. She began describing the dream. In the dream, she was making the flower crown in a beautiful garden. Then someone appeared. It was Ed. He looked like a prince riding a magnificent horse. She gently placed the flower crown on his head and told him she had made it just for him. Afterward, the two happily ran through the endless field of flowers together. Janica stubbornly continued, insisting it was only her friend's dream. Her friends could only smile. It was painfully obvious she was talking about herself. Curious, Clara asked what happened next. Janica replied that her friend couldn't stop thinking about someone's face. Even while sitting alone in her room, that person's image kept appearing in her mind over and over again. It almost felt like love. The instant Clara heard that, she abruptly stood up. I just remembered something important. She immediately fled the scene, leaving Janica alone with Anissa. Anissa nervously wondered how she was supposed to handle such a delicate topic. After thinking for a moment, she spoke honestly. Maybe you're making this too complicated. Whether you like someone or not is already mysterious enough. You should just be honest with your own feelings. Janica slowly nodded. I think you're right. The conversation became slightly confusing afterward, as the names were mixed up. The person speaking at that point was actually Clara, not Anissa. Clara gently warned Janica to be careful. Even if it's only a dream, rumors can still spread. It wouldn't be good for your reputation. Janica thoughtfully agreed. She had only just recovered. Creating unnecessary gossip would only cause more trouble. After thanking Clara for the advice, she announced she was heading back to the dormitory. Clara smiled and waved goodbye. The moment Janica disappeared, Clara slammed her forehead onto the table. This is all Anissa's fault. She left me alone in the most awkward conversation imaginable. Meanwhile, Ed quietly walked through the forest. After everything that had happened, he had finally managed to save a decent amount of money. Thanks to a petition submitted by Phinia, he had also been exempted from paying next semester's tuition. Using the gold he had saved, Ed bought several new tools for his shelter. As he walked home through the woods, he suddenly spotted Janica. For the entire first act, Ed had intentionally avoided getting close to her in order to preserve the original story. But now, Act 1 was finally over. Janica was no longer one of the central figures driving the plot. Perhaps for the first time, the two of them could simply meet as ordinary people. Ed decided that there was no reason to keep avoiding Janica forever. At the very least, he could say hello. He walked over with a gentle smile. It's all over now, you're free. Janica jumped in surprise. She instinctively took a small step back before forcing a smile. Yes, everything's fine. At the same time, the words her friends had told her echoed through her mind. Be honest with your feelings. Her face immediately turned red. Unable to handle the embarrassment, she hurriedly made up an excuse. I have something to do back at the dormitory." After saying a quick goodbye, she practically ran away. Even Ed, who had encouraged her to be honest with herself, was left standing there in complete confusion. Still, he didn't think much of it. He had far more important things to do. It was finally time to build a proper home. On the very first day, Ed searched the forest until he found the perfect location for his cabin. The area was spacious, surrounded by sturdy trees that provided plenty of shade, yet secluded enough that it wouldn't attract unwanted attention. Once he found the ideal spot, he immediately got to work. By the third day, he had already collected a huge supply of lumber. Thanks to his growing mastery of windblade, cutting trees had become incredibly efficient. The construction progressed far faster than he expected. On the sixth day, however, he temporarily stopped gathering wood because the academy released the semester examination results. To his surprise, his grades were excellent. His scores on the theoretical exams ranked among the best of the freshmen. Despite that achievement, Janica still seemed to avoid him whenever they crossed paths. Even stranger, her friends kept giving him mysterious looks whenever they saw him. By the 18th day, Ed had almost finished gathering every log he needed. At one point, he even wondered if anyone in the entire game world had ever trained Windblade to the level he had reached. On the 20th day, the academy officially entered its vacation period. With no more classes to worry about, Ed devoted all of his time to building the cabin. Then another unexpected incident occurred. While checking one of the traps he had set to catch food, he discovered Lucy sleeping peacefully inside it. Ed let out a helpless sigh. Maybe using dried meat as bait wasn't such a good idea after all. Lucy simply loved it too much. On the 27th day, the head maid Belle Maya visited him carrying herbs and freshly gathered mushrooms. After handing them over, she casually asked how things were going with Janica. When Ed honestly replied that Janica probably hated him, Belle Maya could only stare at him in complete confusion. 3 days later, disaster struck. The central support pillar of his cabin collapsed. Within seconds, the entire structure came crashing down. Ed quickly realized that perfectly fitting the wooden joints together wasn't enough. Without proper structural support, the entire building would remain unstable. Later that day, while visiting a bakery, he unexpectedly ran into Janica and her friends. The moment Janica noticed him, she turned bright red and immediately ran away again, leaving her poor friends behind to awkwardly face Ed once more. On the 37th day, Ziggs arrived to help with construction. As they worked together hammering the roof into place, Ziggs casually commented that Taylor really seemed like a good person. Ed immediately replied that he wasn't. Deep down, however, he smiled. If Taylor and Ziggs became close friends just as they had in the original story, then perhaps the timeline was finally correcting itself. Ziggs pointed toward one side of the roof. "Should we hammer this part too?" Ed shook his head. "No, that's where the chimney will go." Day after day, more pieces fell into place. Finally, on the 45th day, Ed set down his knife. He quietly stepped inside his newly completed cabin. Sitting on the wooden floor, he looked around. There were no decorations, no furniture, nothing luxurious. But there were solid walls, a sturdy roof, a proper door. Even insects could no longer wander inside. For the first time since arriving in this world, Ed truly felt at home. The system displayed a notification. Construction complete. Log cabin successfully built. A faint smile appeared on Ed's face. He finally had a place he could call home. Outside, hidden behind the trees, Janica nervously gathered her courage. Meanwhile, Ed lay comfortably inside the cabin, mentally planning the next improvements. The walls, floor, and fireplace were already complete. Next, he wanted to build a fence, create a firewood storage area, and make a few finishing touches. Suddenly, something landed on the roof. It was Lucy. Naturally, she had climbed up there and fallen asleep. A moment later, another voice called out, "Ed." Janica stood outside, looking incredibly nervous. Surprised, Ed opened the door. "How did you find this place?" Janica remembered a recent conversation with Belle Maya. The head maid had mentioned visiting young Master Ed's camp in the forest. "The cabin?" Janica had asked. Belle Maya looked surprised. "You've seen it?" "I noticed it from a distance while walking through the forest." Belle Maya smiled. "Ed built it all by himself. Honestly, it's much sturdier and prettier than I expected. I never imagined he had talent for construction." Then she invited Janica to visit the cabin herself. Janica curiously asked whether Belle Maya was also interested in things like that. Belle Maya laughed. "Of course. I'm human too. When someone builds such a beautiful cabin with their own hands, anyone would naturally become curious." That conversation gave Janica an excuse. Now, standing outside the cabin with flushed cheeks, she awkwardly explained herself. "I was just passing by to visit Marilda, and since I happened to see your cabin, I thought I'd stop and take a closer look. It's only natural to be curious." Ed nodded without suspicion. "I suppose that's true." Janica looked around before smiling. "It looks wonderful." Ed thanked her. "I only finished building it today. Weren't the spirits talking about it?" Janica hesitated before answering. They mentioned it a little. They said you've become really muscular. They talked about your broad back, strong arms, and rough hands from building the cabin. The moment she repeated those words, she became so embarrassed that her face turned completely red. She quickly tried changing the subject. I only heard the basics. Pretending not to notice her embarrassment, Ed invited her inside. It isn't much yet. You might be disappointed. Janica shook her head immediately. No, I'd love to see it. Inside the cabin, she looked around in amazement. You built all of this by yourself? That evening, the two sat quietly beside the campfire. Janica slowly sipped her tea before speaking. So many people have helped me. The princess, Lortel, my friends, they've all sacrificed so much for me. How am I ever supposed to repay all of them? Ed smiled gently. They helped because they wanted to. If you can't repay them, then don't. Your friends aren't loan sharks. Janica blinked. She had never considered that possibility. Ed quietly understood why. This was simply the way Janica lived. Her overwhelming sincerity had become the very thing weighing her down. Even after receiving financial support, tuition assistance, and countless acts of kindness, she voluntarily moved out of the luxurious Ophelis dormitory simply because she wanted to owe everyone a little less. Ophelis offered private rooms and the finest facilities in the academy. Instead, Janica chose the far more crowded Dex dormitory, where 8 students shared a single room. Living there was uncomfortable. Being surrounded by constant envy made her feel trapped, almost like she was living inside a prison. But even sacrificing her own comfort couldn't solve the real problem. The cycle simply continued. Looking at her, Ed quietly spoke. If you ever want to be alone for a while, you can come here. I don't mind. Janica smiled softly. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely at ease. Then, if you ever feel overwhelmed, if there's something you can't handle alone, you can rely on me. No matter what happens, I'll help you. Ed smiled as he looked up at the night sky. Overwhelmed, he softly repeated the word. Then his expression became serious. The second semester was approaching. Act 2 was about to begin. Everything would start because of one small worn-out book, the sealed grimoire of the sage. Written by the legendary sage Sylvania, the grimoire contained records of advanced spectral magic, powerful spells capable of altering the very laws of nature. It looked like nothing more than an old book, yet it would soon unleash a storm across the academy, a storm that would consume everything in its path. When Lortel first saw the grimoire, she simply smiled. It smells like money. Ed quietly thanked Janica for her kind words. Still, he doubted he would ever need that kind of help. The one who truly had countless trials ahead was Taylor. Even if those events had nothing to do with him directly, Ed silently wished for Taylor's success. And so, Episode 2 of the Extras Academy Survival Guide began. Its title was The Occupation of Ophelis Dormitory. The Ophelis Dormitory was reserved for the Academy's honor students. Its residents lived almost like nobles. They enjoyed priority seating in class, greater freedom during meals, personal maids, and countless privileges unavailable to ordinary students. But those very privileges would soon become the center of the next conflict. As the vacation ended, torrential rain struck the southwestern region of Valeries. To ensure the honor students returned safely, the Academy prepared luxurious carriages and boats to transport every resident of the Ophelis dormitory back to campus in comfort. Meanwhile, the students from the Dex dormitory were forced to return on foot through the raging storm. Even under such terrible conditions, they still had to reach the dormitory before the deadline or lose valuable points. Furious over the blatant unfairness, the Dex students gathered in front of Ophelis dormitory and began a full-scale protest that looked ready to ignite a war. At the same time, Lortel calmly sealed a letter and gazed out the window at the pouring rain. Everything was unfolding exactly as she had predicted. Ed understood that moments like these were where merchants truly demonstrated their worth. One of Lortel's agents had already contacted the representative of the lower-ranked students, but the young man wasn't interested in compromise. He simply wanted to destroy both the academy and Ophelis dormitory. The dissatisfaction among the common students had already reached its breaking point. All they needed was a reason that everyone could rally behind. That spark came from William, a student famous for his manipulative speeches and provocative nature. He became the one who ignited the rebellion. The chosen justification was simple and effective. Regular students were being discriminated against by being forced to walk back through a disastrous storm, while others enjoyed far better treatment. Soon afterward, a proposal was submitted suggesting that the return deadline should be extended because of the weather. The head educator of Ophelis dormitory, along with several members of the academy's administration, openly sided with Lortel. At that point, it didn't even matter whether the proposal would be accepted. Simply bringing the issue into public discussion was enough to fuel the anger of the common students and turn the controversy into something much larger. The academy also revealed that Ophelis dormitory contained priceless decorations donated by noble families. The paintings, carpets, wooden furniture, and countless ornaments had all been crafted by renowned artisans. From Lortel's perspective, the more damage the rebels caused to these expensive items, the better. Every broken masterpiece would become another devastating blow to the Academy's already fragile finances, which had yet to recover from the disastrous Glaskin incident. Meanwhile, negotiations regarding the sealed grimoire were still ongoing, allowing the Elte Commercial Association to strengthen its bargaining position. Standing by the window, Lortel quietly wondered when the rain would finally stop. Not a single ray of sunlight pierced the dark clouds overhead. Looking at the gloomy sky, she realized it reminded her of the slums where she had grown up. Strangely enough, that thought brought her a small sense of comfort. Sylvania Academy was often romanticized as a paradise of knowledge and brilliance, but to Lortel, the dirty streets of the slums felt far more real than the Academy's dazzling image. The countless documents filled with conspiracies scattered across her desk were proof of that reality. She reflected on the path she had walked throughout her entire life. She had survived by hiding her true feelings, betraying others whenever necessary, and trusting no one. While countless people desperately struggled just to stay alive, she had become someone who relied on deceit above all else. Deep inside, she believed nothing could ever wash away that filthy nature. Perhaps that was why she constantly searched for someone like herself. In a place overflowing with talented, honest, and radiant students, she hoped there might exist at least one person capable of recognizing the miserable existence of a rat covered in filth. She never stopped searching. Even while clinging to that hopeless wish, she remained alone because she firmly believed that a person's true nature could never change. To survive such a miserable reality, Lortel continued playing the same role she always had. She became the curtain that concealed the darkness lurking behind the stage. That was why everyone knew her by a single title, the Veil of Shadows. Meanwhile, the revolution finally erupted in front of Ophelis Dormitory, and the merchant who had orchestrated everything watched the chaos unfold from the shadows. Ed recalled that, in the original story, this incident centered around the protagonist fighting his way through the lower-ranked students who had been manipulated into opposing Lortel. As the hero climbed from the first floor to the fifth floor, he would face a series of mid-bosses blocking his path while simultaneously helping the rebels occupy the dormitory. The first of those bosses was Tate. Ed immediately remembered him. Tate had once mocked Taylor by calling him a worthless loser. After Taylor's friends beat him up, Tate developed a deep grudge against them. Eventually, Lortel bought his loyalty. His assignment was incredibly simple. He only needed to disable the maid's security on the first floor and unlock the entrance. The moment the doors opened, the angry students would storm straight into the dormitory. According to the original storyline, Tate would then stand in the protagonist's way as the first-floor boss while the occupation continued. The merchant asked if Tate was the subordinate Lortel had recruited. Ed nodded. That's right. He's the one responsible for the first floor. Then an unexpected truth surfaced. In the original timeline, the person who had filled Tate's role wasn't Tate at all. It had been Ed Rothstaler himself. Ed was completely confused. He couldn't understand how he had somehow become nothing more than a secondary boss during the second act of the story. To understand what happened, they had to go back 2 days earlier. At that time, Ed was fully focused on improving his hunting abilities. He spent every day practicing with his bow while sharpening his instincts in the forest. Even he admitted that the original Ed's body simply wasn't built for combat, but he continued using the bow on every hunt in the hope of eventually acquiring at least one worthwhile combat skill. More surprisingly, his isolated life in the forest was attracting more visitors with each passing day. Sometimes it felt like living alone in the woods made him even more popular than staying in the dormitory. Ed mentally listed his 3 most frequent visitors. Visitor number 1 was the Academy's genius mage, Lucy. She appeared whenever she pleased and usually ended up sleeping on the roof of his cabin. Every tiny improvement fascinated her. One day, she noticed he had finally installed a proper door and excitedly asked if he planned to build a chimney next. After Ed chased her away, she simply pointed at the window without any glass and innocently asked whether it was supposed to be a skylight. Ed couldn't help thinking that Lucy was unbelievably clueless, but also strangely entertaining. After all, he wasn't building an artistic cabin. He was just poor. Visitor number 2 was Janica. Unlike everyone else, Ed genuinely welcomed her visits. She always brought him something useful, helped with household chores, and even communicated with the surrounding spirits. To Ed, she was easily his favorite guest. Curious one day, he asked why she always went so far out of her way to help him. Janica immediately looked away, her face turning bright red as she became completely flustered. Ed simply stared at her in confusion. Huh, what's wrong with her? Trying to change the subject, Janica asked how often Lucy visited him. Ed casually replied that Lucy showed up from time to time and could sometimes be a little dangerous. That was all there was to Visitor B. The reason Ed had been thinking about all of this was because Visitor C had finally arrived. It was none other than the Golden Daughter herself, Lortel. Ed immediately realized why she had come. As the mastermind known as the Veil of Shadows during the second act, she was gathering allies to launch the occupation of Ophelis Dormitory. However, Ed had already made up his mind. This time, he refused to get involved. No matter what offer Lortel made, he intended to reject it. At least that was his plan if events continued following the original storyline. Then Lortel informed him of something completely unexpected. Tate, the person originally assigned to carry out the operation, had suddenly fallen ill for reasons no one could explain. Ed immediately asked what had happened and why Tate had suddenly collapsed. Lortel explained that, in the original story, Tate was supposed to fight Taylor. Although Taylor beat him up, his injuries were never serious enough to keep him out of action. However, events had changed. This time Tate had gone too far with his insults. He claimed that Taylor was even worse than that useless insect named Ed Rothstaler. The moment those words left his mouth, Ziggs punched him so hard that he blacked out on the spot. Afterward, Ziggs even scolded him for daring to speak about Ed that way. Lortel admitted she wasn't sure whether Ziggs had become furious because Tate insulted Taylor or because he insulted Ed. Either way, no one had ever seen Ziggs lose his temper like that before. Ed could only sigh. Human emotions really weren't something you could ever predict. Lortel then explained the task she wanted him to perform. It wasn't difficult. All he had to do was obtain headmaid Aelis's key, unlock the entrance to Ophelis dormitory, and allow the lower-ranked students to enter. Many people were capable of completing such a simple job, but there was one problem. No matter how much money she offered, they might betray her afterward and report everything to the Academy's investigators. If someone exposed her as the mastermind behind the entire incident, everything she had built would collapse. She couldn't trust anyone. Ed quickly realized why she had chosen him instead. His reputation had already been destroyed. Since he had been expelled from the dormitory, people would naturally assume he wanted revenge against the Academy. Lortel calmly pointed out exactly that. Ed honestly admitted that revenge wasn't something he cared about anymore. Then Lortel casually offered him 20 gold coins. Deal. Ed accepted without the slightest hesitation. In his mind, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was simply restoring the story to its original path. With only one day remaining before the occupation of Ophelis dormitory, Ed sat beneath the roof of his cabin while rain continued pouring outside. He slowly walked around the campfire as he organized everything he remembered about the future. The dormitory occupation happened before the conflict over the sealed grimoire. Lortel's scheme to cripple the Academy financially would succeed exactly as planned. According to the original story, she would later establish an organization known as the Market, an influential commercial group that rivaled Princess Phinea's student council. From that point onward, the Academy's narrative split into two opposing factions. One represented ideals and justice. The other represented realism, commerce, and profit. As for Ed, he had absolutely no intention of choosing sides based on principles. He would simply wait, watch who emerged victorious, and join the winning faction. Of course, he had to survive long enough to make that decision. Just then, Janica arrived at his cabin. Even though she was completely soaked by the rain, she squeezed the water from her clothes and smiled. She admitted she had expected the rain to stop by now before commenting on how amazing Ed really was. To her, his cabin looked no different from an ordinary campsite, yet he managed to live there comfortably even during storms like this. Ed simply smiled. You get used to it. Janica then mentioned that perhaps it was finally time for her to leave Ophelis dormitory. She explained that she would soon be moving into Dex dormitory, which was much smaller. Because of that, she would have to throw away many of her belongings. Before leaving, she asked if Ed needed any furniture. He replied that he would let her know if anything came to mind. Janica immediately began listing everything she could give him. She had clocks, extra pillows, lanterns, daily necessities. She felt it would be wasteful to throw them away, so she wanted Ed to have them instead. Ed happily accepted. That made Janica beam with excitement. She promised that once the semester officially began, she would bring everything to his cabin. A moment later, she casually asked how often Lucy came to visit him. Ed shrugged. Every now and then. Ironically, Lucy was already there. She lay quietly on the roof of the cabin, allowing the rain to soak her without the slightest concern. Ed couldn't help reflecting on her strange life. Lucy possessed overwhelming magical talent, but that incredible power had come with its own burden. She had spent years hiding from the destiny everyone expected her to fulfill, using laziness as an excuse to avoid reality. No matter how absent-minded she appeared, moments like rainy days always seemed to make her quietly reflect on her life. Ed had grown so accustomed to the sight that he barely paid attention anymore. Janica noticed how indifferent he seemed toward Lucy and found it oddly amusing. Rather than continue the conversation, Ed quickly changed the subject. There was something much more important. Janica was still living inside Ophelis dormitory. The semester hadn't started yet, and the occupation would begin the very next night. If she stayed there, she could easily become trapped in the chaos. Without revealing the truth, Ed decided to help her indirectly. He asked her for a favor. The following evening, around 9 o'clock, could she meet him near the rose garden beside Ophelis dormitory? Janica froze. Her face instantly turned bright red. To her, it sounded suspiciously like an invitation to a date. Ed, meanwhile, was only trying to lure her away from the dormitory before the rebellion began. Unable to hide her embarrassment, Janica quickly agreed before hurrying away. Watching her disappear into the rain, Ed let out a long sigh. He quietly looked toward the cloudy sky. Soon the semester would begin. The rain would finally end. Autumn would fill the forest with its familiar scent. His peaceful vacation was almost over. The following night, at exactly 9 o'clock, Ziggs was busy training. As he exercised, he reflected on yesterday's events. Perhaps he had gone too far when he punched Tate. He needed to control his emotions better. He certainly hadn't expected Elka to become so furious over what had happened. As he walked downstairs, something outside caught his attention. Through the window, he spotted Ed sprinting toward Ophelis' dormitory. Meanwhile, Ed slipped inside the building and immediately met one of the maids secretly working for Lortel. He asked where everyone else was. The maid explained that every other servant had been gathered inside the meeting room. The head maid had arranged a lengthy meeting as an excuse to keep them occupied and far away from the entrance. She then handed Ed a bucket filled with a strange liquid before informing him that everything had already been prepared. Ed nodded. Every piece was now in place. The occupation of Ophelis' dormitory was finally about to begin. Outside, a massive crowd of students had gathered with burning torches in their hands. Their angry voices echoed throughout the academy. "We won't accept this unfair treatment anymore. There must be equal justice for everyone." William, the representative of the lower-ranked students, stepped forward and urged everyone to stand together before leading the crowd toward the entrance. Then, the front door suddenly swung open. The students froze for a brief moment. Then they surged inside like a tidal wave. William smiled as he looked at Ed. So Ed Rothstaler really accepted the job. Everything had already been arranged. Even the maid waiting near the entrance was secretly cooperating while pretending to be a hostage. She silently nodded to confirm it. William became emotional. He admitted that he had always agreed with Ed's complaints about the Academy's unfair privileges. Looking back, he regretted believing all the rumors surrounding him. "I shouldn't have judged you. You're actually a good person." Ed, however, had no interest in listening. Yeah, just keep moving." As William eagerly led the students deeper inside the dormitory, Ed watched him leave with mixed feelings. Unfortunately, William would become the scapegoat for everything that happened that night. Ed honestly felt a little guilty. Meanwhile, the maid quietly slipped away. No one stopped her. After all, every person capable of receiving her report had already been locked inside the meeting room. Head maid Alice, the one responsible for controlling the dormitory's protective rune system, had already fallen into Lortel's hands. The defensive runes activated throughout the building. One after another, every student's room was sealed shut. Everything was proceeding exactly as it had in the original storyline. Every step of the operation had been carefully orchestrated by the Veil of Shadows herself. Lortel calmly approached Ed with a satisfied smile. "You finished much faster than I expected." She praised him for handling the operation so efficiently before glancing down at her soaked stockings with visible annoyance. "I really hate this kind of weather." Ed looked at Lortel and asked if she had been watching everything from the beginning. Walking calmly beside him, Lortel nodded. "The academy staff will move in soon to suppress the students," she said. "We need to finish before they arrive." Ed simply nodded. "Go ahead." However, before leaving, Lortel suddenly stopped. "There is something I've genuinely wanted to ask you." After a brief pause, she quietly asked, "Have you ever killed anyone?" Ed remained silent for a moment before answering, "No, I've never killed anyone." Lortel lowered her gaze. "Neither have I." Then after another brief silence she added, "But I've done things that aren't much different." She confessed that in order to survive she had ruined countless lives. To avoid being betrayed, she always betrayed others first. She had lived her entire life carrying the weight of those choices, convincing herself they were necessary. Deep down, however, she knew they were only excuses. By dragging countless people into a sea of greed and sin, she had earned the title of the Daughter of Gold. Yet no one understood better than Lortel herself that she deserved neither admiration nor sympathy. Perhaps that was why she constantly searched for someone who could truly acknowledge her. Looking directly into Ed's eyes, she quietly asked, "Could you ever be kind to someone like me?" Ed studied her expression. For a brief moment she looked less like the calculating merchant everyone feared, and more like an incredibly lonely person. Whether someone was good or evil, loneliness eventually reached everyone. People trapped in darkness instinctively searched for others crawling through the same mud, hoping to find even the smallest fragment of understanding. Perhaps that tiny connection was all they considered redemption. But Ed slowly shook his head. "No, you have to take responsibility for the choices you've made." More importantly, he wasn't the person she was searching for. Lortel quietly lowered her head. I suppose that was a pointless question. She realized that Ed was fundamentally different from her. Without another word, she regained her usual composure. "There isn't much time left. I should finish what I came here to do." As she walked away, Ed unconsciously let out a sigh of relief. Now Lortel would meet with head maid Alice to complete the final stage of the operation. Once the dormitory's defensive runes fully activated and chaos spread throughout the building, control of the magical barrier would eventually pass to William. the leader of the lower-ranked students. At that point, the story would enter its next phase. Empowered by the dormitory's defensive system, William would become the stage boss of this chapter. According to the original storyline, Taylor would eventually defeat him. As for Ed, his role was much simpler. He only needed to stall for time until Taylor arrived, fight him just long enough to fulfill the scenario, and then deliberately lose. After that, Taylor would continue climbing to the second floor while the story unfolded exactly as it originally had. It was a necessary sacrifice. Meanwhile, in the rose garden, Janica patiently waited. She noticed a carriage arriving unusually late at night and wondered whether something important had happened. Looking around, she quietly asked herself why Ed still hadn't arrived. At least he had left her a note explaining that he might be late. That alone made her believe he must have prepared something special. In truth, Janica barely paid attention to everything happening around the academy. Likewise, Ed wasn't particularly concerned about what she was doing either. The only thing that mattered to him was keeping her safely away from Ophelis' dormitory when the occupation began. Still, during the past 3 days, Janica had found herself thinking about Ed constantly. Although she felt guilty for it, she continued asking Marilda about him whenever she had the chance. That was how she learned Lucy wasn't the only person visiting Ed's forest cabin. Belle Maya, Princess Phinia, Ziggs, even Lortel herself, all of them had visited him recently. The nearby spirits quietly whispered among themselves that by pure coincidence, every single visitor happened to be a female student. Fortunately, they never mentioned that to Janica. It probably would have broken her heart. Completely unaware of those conversations, Janica continued waiting. She even worried about whether she looked presentable enough when Ed finally arrived. Eventually, she decided to return to the dormitory for just a moment. She told herself she only wanted to freshen up a little. In reality, she wanted to grab a prettier hair accessory. Without realizing it, she walked straight back toward Ophelis' dormitory. At almost the same time, Taylor and his companions arrived. Their goal was simple. They intended to stop the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. Among the group was Elvira, the academy's top alchemy student. The moment she arrived, she became anxious about the herbs stored inside her room. "Do you have any idea how valuable those herbs are?" The others advised her to leave everything to the academy staff. Elvira immediately refused. "If I don't cast preservation magic soon, they'll lose all their medicinal properties." Taylor was already losing his patience. He asked someone to stop her before she rushed inside alone. Ayla calmly suggested waiting to see what happened. After all, Elvira was the strongest student in the alchemy department. She could probably protect herself. Taylor immediately shook his head. That's exactly the problem. She's not the one in danger. Everyone else is. If Elvira lost control of her alchemical reagents, the entire dormitory could become a disaster zone. He tried one last time to stop her. Elvira ignored him completely. "I'm done talking." She marched toward the 4th floor where her room was located. Taylor called after her. "You're really only going to check your herbs?" She nodded. "But if anyone tries to stop me, I'll force my way through." Without hesitation, she kicked the door open. The room beyond was completely wrecked. Furniture had been overturned. Footprints covered the floor. Everything was in ruins. Then she noticed someone quietly sitting beneath the staircase. Ed Rothstaler. Taylor immediately frowned. "What are you doing here?" Everyone's eyes turned toward Ed. Elvira glanced around the destroyed room before smiling with interest. "Well, this is unexpected." She looked back at Ed. "Are you planning to stop us?" Ed slowly stood. "I'm sorry, but none of you can go upstairs." Elvira laughed. "You actually think you can stop us?" She had already heard from Ziggs that Ed possessed respectable magical talent. Even so, she considered him nothing more than a second-year student capable of using only basic spells. On her side stood Taylor, an outstanding swordsman, Ayla, a skilled mage, and herself the academy's best alchemist. The difference in strength was overwhelming. Taylor stepped forward. "Explain what's happening upstairs." Ed remained silent. Seeing no other option, Taylor charged. Ed instantly hurled a piece of furniture into his path. Taylor sliced straight through it. Elvira noticed something interesting. Even while throwing the furniture, Ed had secretly cast a basic spell. She assumed his first target would be Taylor. She was wrong. Ed suddenly unleashed a wind blade straight upward. The spell sliced through the chandelier hanging above them. The massive fixture crashed toward Taylor. He barely managed to leap out of the way. At that exact moment, the dormitory's defensive runes began malfunctioning. Panic spread throughout the building. Students shouted from every direction, asking if everyone was all right. Ayla reassured them while trying to assess the situation. Then another wind blade flashed across the room. It narrowly missed Elvira's neck. Instead, it sliced through part of her hair and tore open her bag. Her expression immediately changed. This wasn't a bluff. Ed was genuinely trying to stop them. More importantly, if he was willing to fight this desperately, then something extremely important had to be happening upstairs. Before she could react, Ed had already repositioned himself. She instinctively reached for her alchemical bag. Ed was faster. Ignition. Flames erupted between them, forming a blazing wall that completely blocked her path. Ed quietly thought to himself. The battlefield was finally ready. Elvira's face darkened. This was bad. She had completely underestimated him. His decisions were fast. His timing was flawless. Ziggs had given her terrible information. Ed's magical ability was far beyond what she had expected. As the Academy's greatest alchemist, she possessed incredible combat potential. Unfortunately, without her chemical reagents and specialized equipment, that strength dropped almost to zero. Most alchemists carried enchanted rings or necklaces as backup equipment. Confident in her own talent, Elvira had never bothered. Only then did she realize what Ed had done. First, he dropped the chandelier, then he created a wall of fire. Both actions prevented her from reaching her equipment. Still, something didn't add up. If taking away her bag had truly been his objective, he could have simply stolen it. Instead, he left it where it was. What a bastard. Even so, she smiled. She still had one hidden trump card. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a prepared formula and summoned a spirit that had been strengthened with fire-resistant enhancements and physical reinforcement. Within seconds, the spirit transformed into a massive monster. Meanwhile, Isla began preparing a large-scale water spell to extinguish the flames. Before she could finish chanting, another wind blade wrapped in fire shot directly toward her. Taylor reacted instantly. With one slash, he intercepted the attack. Don't stand still. He knew Isla possessed excellent magical theory, but almost no real combat experience. As attacks continued raining toward them, he had no choice but to protect her. The two of them became trapped in the middle of Ed's carefully prepared battlefield. Ayla looked at Taylor. If I create an opening, can you defeat him? Taylor answered without hesitation. Leave it to me. Immediately, Ayla sent her grotesque muscular rabbit spirit charging toward Ed. The creature smashed through the battlefield, creating the opening Taylor needed. Taylor's eyes sharpened. Now was the time to end this. At the same moment, Elvira made her move. Ignoring the flames engulfing her cloak, she dashed straight through the fire and finally recovered her chemical supplies. With a confident grin, she looked at Ed. Miss me. Ed meanwhile dodged the giant spirit's attacks before preparing another wind blade aimed directly at Elvira. She was already ready. Throwing a chemical reagent into the spell's path, she triggered a violent reaction. A thick cloud of smoke exploded across the hallway. The smoke rapidly extinguished the flames while suppressing magical activity throughout the area. As the fire died down, Ed swiftly finished the giant spirit with a single strike from his dagger. The creature collapsed onto the floor. Elvira smiled. So, what exactly does a mage do after losing the ability to use magic? You've been awfully confident. And unlike you, we still have a swordsman. Taylor immediately charged forward. He couldn't understand why Ed kept retreating. Ed deliberately knocked another piece of furniture into his path. Balanced on top of it was a bucket filled with oil that had been prepared earlier. The moment Isla saw it, her face turned pale. Are you insane? If that catches fire, people could die. Taylor didn't slow down. It doesn't matter whether the flames come from magic or oil. My elemental slash can cut through either one. Before anyone gets hurt, I'll put out the fire. Ed had carefully prepared everything before the battle even began. As the smoke spread through the room, Elvira interrupted everyone, pointing out that the windows were already open wide enough for the smoke to escape. She also noticed that the flammable rug had been removed and that there were no other combustible objects nearby. That was when a disturbing thought crossed her mind. Had Ed predicted every step of this situation from the very beginning? Before she could stop him, Ed had already drawn his bow. Taylor immediately rushed toward him, believing that a single arrow wouldn't be difficult to deal with. However, as the arrow flew through the air, he realized its trajectory wasn't aimed at him at all. It was heading straight toward Alia, who at that moment was completely unable to use magic to defend herself. Taylor shouted a warning, but before the arrow could reach its target, Elvira stepped in. Using a chemical formula, she summoned a mechanical hand, a magical device capable of intercepting small projectiles. The mechanical hand caught the arrow effortlessly. As she examined it, Elvira frowned. The arrow was wrapped in cloth, making it incapable of seriously injuring anyone. If this wasn't meant to hurt someone, then what was its purpose? She wondered. Her instincts immediately told her something was wrong. She warned Taylor to stay alert because she was certain Ed still had another trick prepared. Unfortunately, it was already too late. Taylor charged straight at Ed while, above them, a loud noise echoed from the upper floor. Ed quietly smiled to himself. The time has finally come. The boss of the second floor had been released. Even Clavius, the coward who had been hiding until now, had finally appeared. Knowing his objective had been fulfilled, Ed stopped resisting and deliberately allowed Taylor to defeat him. Watching the entire scene, Elvira couldn't understand his actions. Later, even Taylor questioned whether Ed had completely lost his mind. No one would go that far without a reason. But Elvira couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The entire battle had felt like a performance. If Ed had truly wanted to win, he never would have confronted them directly. He would have remained hidden in the shadows, dropping the massive chandelier onto them or using countless other deadly traps. Instead, he had stood openly before them like he wanted everyone to watch. Even during the fiercest moments of the fight, he never showed any genuine intention of killing anyone. It was almost as if he had simply been acting. Ed looked at Taylor and calmly asked, "Are you done?" Then he sat down, completely exhausted. "If the fight's over," he said, "you can stop yelling at me." Taylor stared at him in confusion. He couldn't understand how someone who had fought so intensely only moments ago could suddenly surrender without hesitation. At that same moment, loud noises began echoing from the second floor. Elvira finally voiced the conclusion she had reached. Ed lost on purpose. Alia looked at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" Taylor also began putting the pieces together. "Are you saying he was holding back against us?" Elvira nodded confidently. "I'm not leaving this place until I get an answer. I know he restrained himself during the entire fight." Silence filled the room as everyone stared at one another. Then, suddenly, the door opened. Janica stepped inside. Just moments earlier, she had been walking alone, nervously wondering whether she should change her hair accessory before meeting Ed. She worried someone might laugh at her for caring so much over such innocent feelings. Still, imagining a happy future with him was one of the few comforts she allowed herself. Unfortunately, reality proved far crueler than imagination. The boy she had been looking forward to meeting was lying on the floor, covered in blood after being attacked by a group of suspicious people. Her expression immediately changed. "What did you do to Ed?" she demanded. Deep down, Janica had already felt something was strange. Perhaps Ed had simply been caught off guard, but she knew him far too well. During the Glaskin hunt, she had witnessed how practical and resourceful he was. No matter how impossible the situation became, Ed always found a solution. Maybe, just this once, he had failed. She remembered offering to help him, but Ed had refused. Instead, he had specifically told her to stay away from the dormitory that night so she wouldn't become involved or get hurt. While she had been worrying about her appearance, he had been risking his life. Looking around at everyone, she asked again, "What are you doing to him?" Taylor quickly answered, "I'm actually glad you came. Some students seized control of the dormitory, but Ed stopped them from advancing." Alia immediately corrected him. "That's not entirely true." Then she looked directly at Janica. "You're our enemy now." Janica's expression didn't change in the slightest. "I don't care." The moment those words left her mouth, an overwhelming amount of magical energy exploded from her body. An incredibly oppressive aura filled the entire room. Ed immediately tried to stop her. "It's okay," Janica replied calmly. Then she began summoning spirits. Countless spirits. "It'll only take a minute," she assured him. Alia watched in disbelief. Janica had summoned intermediate spirits of all 4 elemental attributes. She had practically created an entire magical army. Realizing how hopeless the situation had become, Alia warned Taylor, "You won't get past her. Leave while you still can." Even Elvira admitted the truth. If we were already struggling against one aristocrat, imagine fighting the Academy's strongest second-year magic student. She looked at Taylor. "Face reality. Thankfully, we still have time to run." Taylor sighed. "You're right." Ed's strange behavior had already convinced him that something about the takeover of Awfulest Dormitory wasn't normal. The students upstairs were still in grave danger. Even so, Taylor wasn't the type to give up simply because the situation looked impossible. He asked Elvira if her herbs could help somehow. Before she could even answer, disaster struck. One of Janica's attacks came crashing toward him. Taylor froze. Ed's eyes widened in panic. Without hesitation, he grabbed Taylor by the collar. "When I tell you to run," Ed shouted, "run!" He threw Taylor out of the attack's path just before the devastating blow landed. Standing firmly between everyone and Janica, Ed declared that he would hold her back while the others continued toward the second floor. Alia couldn't understand him anymore. "You were the one stopping us this entire time. Why are you helping us now?" Even Elvira questioned his plan. "Are you seriously going to stop all those spirits?" Instead of answering seriously, Ed lightly flicked her forehead. "Just grab the chemicals." Then he casually apologized for cutting her bag earlier. Although surprised by his commanding attitude, Elvira still obeyed. She ran away alongside Taylor and Alia. Janica watched everything in complete shock. "Ed, you don't have to push yourself like this," she pleaded. "You're already injured. You can explain everything later. I'll handle this." Knowing his next request might sound disrespectful, Ed looked at her awkwardly. "Could you calm down a little?" Janica froze. Her face instantly turned bright red. Wait, are you touching me?" Ignoring her embarrassment, Ed continued, "Please send the spirits back. The wind they're creating is so strong I can barely stay on my feet." Janica looked around. Only then did she realize how excessive her magic had become. "You're right," she admitted with an embarrassed smile. "I completely overdid it. I'm such an idiot." She immediately dismissed every spirit she had summoned. The violent winds disappeared. Everyone watching stood there in complete disbelief. Ed had actually managed to stop Janica. He signaled for everyone to continue toward the upper floors. Then, the moment they moved, his body finally gave out. Ed collapsed unconscious. ED, Janica screamed as she rushed to catch him. Later, while treating his injuries, Janica couldn't hide her frustration. Why didn't you tell me anything? Ed smiled weakly. This time everything happened too quickly, but next time I promise I'll tell you. Janica sighed. Those people really went too far. Ed quietly shook his head. I'm pretty sure the next time they see me, they'll be even angrier. Janica looked straight into his eyes. Promise me you won't get hurt like this again. Okay. And thank you for worrying about me. As he rested, Ed reflected on everything that had happened. His plan hadn't gone perfectly. Still, he had successfully fulfilled his role as the boss of the first floor. Now he could finally return to his camp and rest. However, Janica suddenly remembered something important. While passing through the garden, she had seen an enormous carriage decorated with a golden crown. That crest belonged to the leader of the Merchant Association, Lortel's adoptive father, the man responsible for killing her biological father, the infamous Golden King, Alte. In the original story, he was the false final boss who disappeared for most of the game before reappearing during the sealed grimoire arc. The problem was, he had arrived far earlier than he was supposed to. Ed's expression immediately darkened. That could only mean one thing. Something beyond everything he knew was already changing the story. Meanwhile, on the 5th floor of Ophelis Dormitory, Lortel walked through the hallway beside the head maid. With a faint smile, Lortel remarked that everyone knew that suspicious-looking young man. The head maid asked if she was referring to the young master living at the camp. Lortel confirmed she was talking about Ed. The maid commented that he certainly didn't seem like the type of man Lortel usually liked. Lortel chuckled. He is kind of cute. Then her smile faded. But that's not what matters. The truth was that she felt exactly the same as the head maid. For the first time in a long while, she had allowed herself to become emotionally vulnerable in front of someone. Now she couldn't decide whether to believe the things Ed had told her. He had reminded her that every action carried responsibility. Then, after saying those words, he had abandoned her without the slightest hesitation. Lortel simply laughed bitterly. I'll have to get used to it. That's just how life is. The story then reveals the identity of Alice, the head of Ophelis Dormitory. She had worked there for over 20 years, beginning as an apprentice maid at just 15 years old, before eventually becoming the dormitory's manager through years of dedication and hard work. That dormitory was also where Lortel had invested most of her wealth and effort. For years, she had tried to tempt Alice away from her unwavering integrity. Those attempts had cost Lortel enormous financial losses, leaving significant gaps in her accounting records. Even so, she never considered those investments wasted. Because, in that place, she searched for people willing to abandon their beliefs and principles for nothing more than a handful of gold coins. Those were the people she understood. The people who reminded her of herself. Growing up in the ghettos and among merchants who gambled their lives for every single coin, Lortel had learned one harsh lesson. If you didn't stab first, someone else would stab you. Despite all the tragedy she had experienced throughout her life, the story makes one thing clear. Lortel wasn't a villain because of her past. She had always possessed the heart of a hidden villain from the very beginning. At that moment, Lortel turned to Alice and calmly explained that Willen would soon take control of the 4th floor. Once he gained access to the dormitory's magic control system, the entire hall would collapse from the inside. Since everything would appear to be an accident, no one would ever suspect that they were responsible. Satisfied that everything was proceeding according to plan, Lortel said it was time for her to head to the storage room. There, she would simply pretend to be an innocent student who had become frightened and fled to safety. Before she could leave, however, Alice suddenly drew her sword. Since we're being honest, Alice said coldly, I should tell you something. You're definitely not the kind of person I admire. Meanwhile, on the 2nd floor, Taylor and the others had successfully subdued Clavius after he completely lost control. They tied him up, and despite everything that had happened, he reluctantly became part of their group. Not long afterward, Kelly, the guardian of the 3rd floor, was also defeated. Although the group found it strange that one of the twin maids was wandering around alone, they didn't have time to investigate. They continued climbing and unexpectedly reached the 4th floor without much resistance. Looking back, everyone realized something surprising. Out of every floor they had cleared so far, the only one that had truly challenged them was Ed's. As soon as they reached the 4th floor, however, the atmosphere changed completely. Terrified screams echoed throughout the corridor as students ran in every direction, desperately trying to escape. Willen was standing at the center of the chaos, shouting for help. I can't control the magic. The crystal sphere that controlled the dormitory's magical defense system had been placed directly in the middle of the room. This was the trap Alice and Lortel had carefully prepared. The countless defensive magic circles engraved throughout the building, originally designed to repel outside invaders, had begun activating at random. It was like handing a loaded weapon to a child. Willen had completely lost control. Wild magical blasts fired in every direction without pause. The entire dormitory trembled violently, and no one could even tell whether the building was collapsing from the inside or from the outside. Realizing the structure might fall at any moment, several students leaped from the windows in a desperate attempt to survive. The situation rapidly descended into complete catastrophe. Taylor turned toward Elvira. "Do you have any reagent that can stop this?" She quickly analyzed the situation. The night butterfly reagent can disrupt a target's magic. Then she shook her head. "But the rune covering Willen blocks its effects. It won't work." Even so, she immediately reached for another solution. Throwing a reagent called fisherman's weed into the hallway, she created a magical barrier. This should block at least part of the attacks. "It's the best I can do." Without wasting another second, she shoved Clavius outside the barrier. "You and Taylor handle the rest." Clavius stared at her in horror. "Why me?" Meanwhile, Willen could barely remain standing. Chaotic streams of destructive magic ricocheted throughout the corridor, destroying everything they touched. Tears streamed down his face as he completely lost control of himself. Then, a massive explosion shook the entire dormitory. Every window shattered one after another. Outside, Ed and Janica watched the destruction unfold. Janica looked at Ed with concern. "Why are we still here? If you keep pushing yourself like this, your wounds are going to reopen." Ed calmly replied that he was fine. "Most of that blood isn't even mine." Even so, his thoughts were focused elsewhere. Something wasn't right. Everything had unfolded far too perfectly. Not far away stood an elegant carriage. Inside sat one of the most influential men in the Empire, the Golden King, Alte. Normally, someone of his status would travel with more than a dozen escort carriages. This time, however, he had arrived almost alone. That alone was suspicious. Alte was Lortel's adoptive father, and according to the original story, the false final boss who would eventually die after being stabbed by Lortel during the sealed grimoire arc. He wasn't supposed to be at the academy yet. More importantly, why had he remained here for so long? Ed suddenly wondered if Alte had been waiting for the dormitory to collapse. Then another detail caught his attention. Standing beside Alte was Shani, the maid responsible for managing meals on the third floor. Shani was one of the orphans Alice had raised personally. Alice herself had originally been purchased by Lortel, and Shani had eventually risen to become the chief maid of the third floor. Seeing Shani accompanying Alte, Lortel's sworn enemy, made no sense at all. Ed found it almost impossible to believe Shani had betrayed Alice's trust. The two of them had been purchased together and had spent years supporting one another. Then an even more horrifying possibility entered his mind. What if Alice herself had been working with Alte all along? If that were true, then this could become the future where Lortel died. Ed knew just how important Lortel would become later in the story. During Act 3, she would become deeply involved in the political conflict against Fenia. She would also become the protagonist's greatest ally in the battle against the Rothschild family. By Act 4, Ed had already struggled enough to replace Tota as an intermediate boss. If Lortel disappeared now, the entire future would change. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Ed turned toward Janica. "I need a favor. It's something I can't do alone." "I didn't want to involve you." Janica immediately interrupted him. "That's fine. Just tell me what you need." The story then explains the truth behind Lortel's relationship with Alte. Although the world believed she was the obedient adopted daughter of the honorable president of the Alte Trading Corporation, the reality was completely different. For years, Lortel had secretly planned to overthrow him. She knew Alte had murdered her biological parents. Seeking revenge, she had slowly manipulated the corporation's directors and influential merchants, carefully preparing the perfect trap. The negotiations involving the sealed grimoire were merely bait to lure Alte to Sylvania Academy. Once he arrived, the growing crisis within his own company would prevent him from responding before it was too late. Unfortunately, several unexpected events had exposed the truth. Now Ed possessed an official document capable of proving Lortel's betrayal. However, he also understood how this world worked. Loyalty could always be purchased. Lortel might offer someone a mountain of gold, but another person only had to offer slightly more to buy that same person's betrayal. Meanwhile, Alice slowly felt her vision fading. The recent accident had also nearly robbed her of her hearing. She knew this would be her final year serving as the head maid. As the only person who knew the complete truth, the decision she made now would determine everyone's future. Attached to Alte's letter was a document listing every institution secretly controlled by Lortel, along with the enormous flow of money she had been moving behind the scenes. After carefully considering everything, Alice trusted her own judgment. She pointed her sword toward Lortel. "Don't move." She informed her that Lord Alte was already on his way to the dormitory. Watching Lortel's expression carefully, Alice couldn't hide her disappointment. "I thought you were more mature than this." She believed Lortel's true objective had always been revenge against her adoptive father. Although Lortel denied it, Alice simply sighed. "I'm sorry, but in my eyes, you and Alte aren't that different. You both want the same thing." Before either of them could say another word, a tremendous explosion shook the hallway. Taylor's group burst into the room while carrying the unconscious Willen. Immediately, they assumed Alice was responsible for everything. Elvira pointed at her. "She's holding someone hostage." "Everyone be careful." Alice froze in surprise. Meanwhile, Lortel instantly recognized the opportunity. Pretending to be another victim, she threw herself toward Ed's group. She intended to use the confusion to frame Alice. However, someone suddenly looked at her face. "Why do you look like that?" Lortel desperately tried to maintain the perfect expression of fear. Unable to keep the act going any longer, she abruptly turned around and fled. She knew Alti was already approaching. She also knew he trusted no one, not even his own subordinates. That was exactly why he had personally come. Her plan was almost complete. Once everything unfolded, Alte would be blamed for enormous financial crimes as well as the destruction of the dormitory. Fortunately, he hadn't forced his way inside yet. Now all Lortel needed to do was contact the authorities. She secretly prepared a carrier pigeon. "If I can send this, everything will be over." As she hurried through the corridors, exhaustion began overwhelming her. She repeatedly reassured herself that everything would be fine. Even so, a painful thought entered her heart. No one in this world truly understood her. She had always expected betrayal, but knowing it would happen didn't make it hurt any less. Tears slowly rolled down her cheeks. Still, she kept running. She had to reach her room before Alte did. As long as she could send that pigeon, her entire plan could still succeed. Meanwhile, Alte finally arrived at the dormitory's main entrance. Standing directly in his path was a single student. Alte looked at him with annoyance. "Who are you? It's dangerous here. Move aside." The student calmly refused. Because the building is at risk of collapsing, no one is allowed inside until the academy staff arrive. That student was Ed. Alte narrowed his eyes. "Did the academy send you?" Ed calmly shook his head. "No. I'm acting on my own." As the two faced each other, Ed quickly organized everything in his mind. At this moment, only 3 people knew the complete truth. Lortel, who sought revenge against Alte himself, who intended to destroy Lortel's plans while obtaining the sealed grimoire, and Alice, the woman at the very center of the entire conspiracy. Even now, Ed still didn't fully understand why the future had changed so drastically. He knew Lortel was somewhere on the 5th floor. For a brief moment, he considered abandoning everything and going after her himself. Then he remembered Taylor and the others were already up there. He had witnessed Taylor's abilities firsthand. Trusting them, Ed decided to remain where he was. There was nothing else he could accomplish by chasing after Lortel now. His role was to stop Alte from moving forward. Alte had planned everything from the very beginning. As long as everyone outside was kept away from the dormitory, the events unfolding inside would proceed exactly as intended. Realizing this, Ed suddenly changed his attitude. He looked at Alte with an exaggerated expression of surprise. "Oh my, you're the great Alte himself? The president of the Alte Mercantile Organization?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. "I'm sure someone as important as you has a very good reason for being here, but with everything happening at the academy right now, perhaps it would be better if you didn't involve yourself." Alte immediately understood what Ed was trying to do. "So," he said, narrowing his eyes, "you're siding with Lortel." The story then flashes back to 10 minutes earlier. Ziggs had blasted a massive hole through one of the dormitory walls. Ed walked into the room looking outside at the chaos. "The situation out there is a complete mess," he said. Then he turned toward Ziggs. "Why are you still here?" Ziggs shrugged. "I didn't want to get involved. If I lose control, I might accidentally collapse the whole building." After thinking for a moment, he casually added, "Though even that probably wouldn't be enough to kill me." Ed stared at him in disbelief. This kid had far too much confidence in his own strength. Meanwhile, Ziggs looked at the enormous hole he had created. Now it's going to be freezing at night. Ed couldn't help wondering whether this guy actually believed he was some legendary archmage. At that moment, he noticed Janica standing nearby. She smiled awkwardly. "This is probably the first time we've properly introduced ourselves. Our first meeting during the Glaskin incident didn't exactly go well. I'm sorry about that." Ziggs glanced back and forth between them. "So, are you two dating?" Janica's face instantly turned bright red. "No, absolutely not." Then she nervously looked toward Ed. "Did that bother you?" Ed sighed. "It's Ziggs' fault for asking such a rude question." Ziggs dramatically bowed in apology. Sorry. Then he looked back at Ed. "So why were you both looking for me so desperately?" "I need a favor," Ed replied. "I'll repay you later." The story then returns to the present. Hidden nearby, Janica and Ziggs silently listened to the conversation between Ed and Alte. Ed calmly continued speaking. "If you head to the Academy's administrative building, you'll receive a proper welcome. There really isn't any reason for you to force your way into the dormitory." Alte simply smiled. "You're definitely working with Lortel." Then he laughed. "Did she charm you with that pretty face of hers? Instead of gambling on gold you haven't even received yet, why not enjoy the rewards already standing in front of you?" He shook his head. "Lortel has fox blood. I raised her myself. No one knows her better than I do." Then Alte made his offer. "Step aside, I'll give you a much better deal." Ed smiled politely. "Thank you for the generous offer, but I'm not willing to sell myself for a handful of gold coins. Besides, what's the point of simply doubling the payment? Alti understood that negotiation had failed. His expression instantly became cold. If words won't convince you, perhaps blades will. At his command, the guards rushed toward Ed. Without hesitation, Ed turned around and ran. Trying to escape? Alte shouted. Before the guards could catch him, however, a powerful gust of wind slammed directly into them. It was Ziggs. His wind magic scattered the advancing soldiers. Ed, he shouted. Ed glanced back. I'll come back after I check the situation. I'll repay my debt later. Janica smiled. That's fine. Ziggs scratched his head. Honestly, I'm the one who owes him. Watching the two students fight together, Alte couldn't help but acknowledge their strength. They're only students, yet they're far more troublesome than expected. He immediately ordered his guards to attack with full force. Meanwhile, Ed sprinted through the dormitory, kicking open door after door. There was only one person he needed to find, Lortel. When he finally found her, he stopped immediately. Why are you still here? Couldn't you use the back entrance? Or can you no longer run? Without waiting for an answer, he grabbed her hand. Run. As fast as you can. The story then explained something about Lortel's view of the world. To her, every act of kindness always had a hidden motive. The receptionist of the Sharo Trade Guild always treated her warmly because he hoped she would accidentally reveal valuable business information. Caden from the marketing department was always excited to see her because she regularly warned him about important market changes. Even Tenny, the Academy's beloved bird, stayed close to her because she constantly fed him the finest food. In Lortel's eyes, no kindness was ever free. Everything came with a price. As the two of them ran through the corridors together, Ed spoke without slowing down. There's no time to explain everything. I just need one answer. Did Alice betray you? Lortel remained silent. Guilt consumed her heart. She believed everything happening now was the result of one foolish mistake. Her thoughts drifted toward Janica Failover. Unlike herself, Janica had been raised surrounded by love, kindness, and sincerity. Naturally, she returned those feelings to the world without hesitation. Lortel was different. The day she had first approached Ed with her proposal, she had seen genuine warmth in his eyes. For the first time in her life, someone seemed to care about her without greed, without manipulation, and without expecting anything in return. That single moment made her believe perhaps she could experience a relationship like that too. Because of that hope, she trusted too much. She revealed her plans to Alice. She never realized that her hopes were already being crushed. For her entire life, she had believed trusting no one was the only correct way to survive. Yet after meeting Ed, she forgot who she really was. Someone raised in darkness. Someone stained by greed and betrayal. She should never have dreamed of living a happy romantic life. Originally, Lortel had hired 5 people to seize control of Ophelis Dormitory: the head maid Alice, the twin maids Senny and Kelly, Waylon, the representative of the lower-ranking students, and finally, the fallen noble, Ed. Now everything had fallen apart. Alice, Senny, and Kelly had sided with Alte. Waylon also appeared ready to abandon her. Soon, Ed would probably do the same. Ain't able to keep running, Lortel suddenly stopped. I'm sorry, she whispered. I can't guarantee the 20 gold coins I promised you anymore. My entire plan has fallen apart. Even as she spoke, she couldn't understand why she was saying those words. It was as though she had completely lost control of herself. Ed immediately lost his patience. Who asked? Without another word, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her forward. This isn't the time to argue. If Alti catches you now, you die. We'll deal with everything else later. Right now, we escape. Lortel froze. Everything she believed about trust suddenly began to crumble. She had always lived by one rule. Every act of kindness had a hidden motive. If you couldn't see that motive, you should never trust anyone. That was supposed to be an absolute truth. Yet, for the first time in her life, she chose to trust someone anyway. Looking at Ed, she finally revealed the truth. My father, he's manipulating the market. She explained that after the great monster hunt in the eastern mountains, armor prices had fallen dramatically. Alte secretly purchased enormous quantities of armor and monopolized the market. Then he began trading those supplies internally, artificially increasing their value. It was a classic manipulation scheme. To execute it successfully, however, he required an enormous amount of cash in a very short period. That was why he became interested in the sealed grimoire. He believed selling it would provide the funds necessary to complete the operation. That was also why Lortel had been sent to Sylvania Academy. Her mission had always been to steal the grimoire. Ed quietly nodded. That's enough. I already understand. The story then explains how the scheme worked. Several merchants secretly purchased huge amounts of a cheap product. Instead of selling it immediately, they repeatedly traded those goods among themselves, creating the illusion that demand was rapidly increasing. As prices climbed higher and higher, ordinary merchants believed supplies were becoming scarce. Panicked, everyone rushed to buy before prices increased even further. Then, at the perfect moment, the conspirators sold everything at outrageously inflated prices, earning enormous profits. However, the entire scheme depended on trust. If even one merchant sold their stock too early without informing the others, the market would immediately collapse. Prices would crash. Anyone who had invested everything into the monopoly would lose everything. To guarantee absolute control, Lortel had spent years quietly purchasing shares and bonds connected to the 6 major merchants involved in the scheme. Only when Alte left Sharo headquarters could those ownership rights legally be transferred. After hearing the entire explanation, Ed finally understood the true purpose behind the dormitory incident. The occupation of the dormitory was meant to create a financial crisis inside the academy. That would force the academy to purchase the sealed grimoire, and Alte would have no choice but to leave headquarters to obtain the necessary funds. While he was away, you planned to sell all the stored armor. Lortel stared at him in complete disbelief. How did you figure that out so quickly? Ed ignored the question. We only have one option now. We have to send a letter to headquarters. Tell them to sell every piece of armor immediately. Lortel nodded. I have a carrier pigeon in my room. It's my direct line to the people inside headquarters. But my father probably expects that. He may already know exactly who the infiltrators are. Ed thought for a moment before making a decision. Listen carefully. From now on, you stay hidden. If I were Alte, I would have already surrounded both the academy and the island. If you try to escape now, they'll notice immediately. He quickly outlined a new plan. She needed to contact the knights stationed in the quarters and ask them to send an empty carriage toward the arcane mountains. It would create the illusion that she had escaped in that direction. Lortel looked at him. Then where am I supposed to hide? I have a cabin in the forest, Ed answered. You can stay there for 3 days until everything settles down. I'll send the carrier pigeon myself. I'll write something simple. Sell immediately. Your trusted people will understand the rest. Lortel quietly agreed. Just then, Ed suddenly stopped. His eyes narrowed. Someone was waiting outside the back entrance. Without hesitation, he grabbed Lortel's shoulder. Someone's guarding the exit. I'll deal with them. You stay inside. Don't move until I tell you the path is clear. Watching him calmly organize everything in just a few moments, Lortel couldn't help but feel amazed. Ed handled every problem with remarkable speed and precision. It was almost as though he was thinking several moves ahead for both of them. Ed snapped Lortel out of her thoughts and told her to stay focused. She nodded. I understand. Before stepping inside, however, she hesitated. Why are you helping me so much? Only then did he realize he had never actually explained himself. There isn't any special reason, he answered awkwardly. Just do exactly what I told you. Without waiting for another question, he closed the back door behind her and walked away. Left alone, Lortel slowly sat on the floor. A loud rumbling echoed through the dormitory. She couldn't tell whether the sounds were coming from the battle on the upper floor or somewhere much closer, perhaps even the entrance hall itself. Her heart pounded uncontrollably. Outside, someone suddenly spoke. I wasn't expecting you to come out of that door. It was Shawnee. Ed sighed. For the final obstacle, you're pretty disappointing. Without another word, he prepared for battle. Meanwhile, on the top floor of Ophelis' dormitory, the final confrontation was reaching its climax. Every rune engraved throughout the building had been transferred into a single magical cube. Whoever possessed that cube controlled the entire dormitory. The magic swordsman Shink had managed to keep the combat department students at bay, while Alice continuously supported him with powerful spells from the rear. Even with both of them fighting together, however, they still couldn't overcome one person, Taylor McLaurer. After all, he was the story's main protagonist. As the building continued collapsing around them, the final battle on the top floor officially began. Outside, Ed and Shawnee faced each other in silence. Neither of them moved. Ed quietly assessed his condition. He had almost exhausted all of his mana. At most, he could cast only 2 or 3 more spells. Without warning, Shawnee lunged forward. Using her swordsmanship, she aimed a lightning-fast thrust directly at Ed's leg, but Ed effortlessly dodged. He already knew her opening move. He knew every one of her attack patterns. Stepping on her blade, he stopped the thrust completely. Without hesitating, Shawnee reached toward the knives strapped to her thigh and threw them toward him. Ed immediately grabbed her arm before she could complete the motion and knocked every knife far into the distance. He knew her speed. He knew her habits. He knew exactly how she fought. Shawnee's eyes widened in shock. Then she activated her special ability. She and her twin sister possessed a unique gift from birth. Once each day, either sister could temporarily borrow the other's ability. At that moment, Shawnee borrowed her sister's telekinetic power. The knife she had already thrown suddenly changed direction and flew straight back toward Ed. Several blades pierced his body. Believing she had won, Shawnee finally relaxed. Then, Ed remained standing, like an immovable wall. Without showing the slightest expression of pain, he calmly pulled one knife from his chest. So even with your sister's ability, this is all you've got. One by one, he removed every blade from his body. Then he stepped on Shawnee's arm and kicked her sword out of reach. It's over, he said calmly. There's no point continuing. Shawnee refused to surrender. Desperately struggling, she shouted, I can't disappoint Miss Alice. Just go away. Alice has already lost. Those words only made Shawnee angrier. What do you know about Miss Alice? Do you have any idea how much she's suffered? Do you know how many battles she's fought? Fueled by desperation, she activated the dormitory's rune system. A violent magical explosion engulfed the area, filling everything with smoke. Inside the thick fog, Ed quietly reflected. He didn't know much about Shawnee herself, but he knew the original Ed very well. Suddenly, the explosion came to an abrupt stop. Taylor burst through the smoke with his transformation fully activated. His target, Alice. Already weakened, Alice could barely react. Another massive explosion erupted on the dormitory's top floor. Outside, Ed pinned Shawnee to the ground, pressing his knee firmly against her back. He looked down at her without emotion. Even if I understood your entire story, it wouldn't change anything. It's not my problem. Unable to move, Shawnee glared at him with hatred. I'll never forgive you, or Lortel. Moments later, she lost consciousness. Rain slowly began falling from the sky. Ed stood silently beneath it. He realized there were countless stories in this world that he would never know. Many side characters carried painful histories that would never be revealed. Thinking about everything Shawnee had done throughout her life, rescuing orphans, helping countless people, and living according to her own unwavering beliefs, Ed couldn't help but respect her. People like her lived lives that truly mattered. But his own goal had never changed. Ever since awakening inside this body, everything he did had been for one purpose alone: survival. Just then, the system appeared before him. Target incapacitated. New skill acquired. Pain resistance. Ed blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected to gain a new skill. Without wasting any more time, he smashed through a nearby window and climbed into the dormitory. Looking around, he noticed the room was incredibly luxurious. Even so, everything inside was arranged with strict practicality. Books and documents covered the desk. This must be Lortel's room. Opening one of the cabinets, he quickly found the carrier pigeon. He immediately wrote a short message addressed to headquarters. Sell all stored armor immediately. As the pigeon disappeared into the sky, Ed quietly thought, when it returns, it'll bring Alte's downfall. Covered in blood, he slowly walked through the rain. His wounds were far more serious than he had first believed. Perhaps they wouldn't heal anytime soon. He reflected on everything that had happened. Without Zig's help, without Janika's support, Lortel would already have been captured by Alte. Her downfall would have been immediate, and Ed himself would likely already be dead. Fortunately, the decoy carriage had already departed. Alte had no choice but to pursue it. Even if he captured the coachman and learned that Lortel had never actually left the dormitory, it was already too late. By now, the carrier pigeon had almost certainly reached headquarters. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, which meant Lortel should already be waiting safely inside the forest cabin. As Ed continued walking, he suddenly stopped. Standing before him was Lortel herself. Ed forced a weak smile, quite the warm welcome. Then his expression changed. At that moment, a terrifying realization struck him. He had become complacent. The true mastermind behind everything had never been Alte. It had always been Lortel. Looking back at everything that had happened, every event fit together perfectly. From every possible angle, she had orchestrated every single move. Now they were completely alone in an isolated forest. It was the perfect place to commit the perfect crime. Lortel was the true villain. Ed desperately tried to think of a way to survive, but his body no longer obeyed him. Lortel slowly approached. It really is over, he thought. Then, instead of attacking him, she pulled out a knife and cut a strip from her own clothing. Using the torn fabric, she hurriedly wrapped his wounds, creating a makeshift tourniquet to stop the bleeding. Why are you hurt this badly? She desperately tried to save him. The rain had already stopped. She lit the fireplace inside the cabin. Then she gently helped Ed sit beside the warmth. Stay close to the fire. You need to warm yourself. After resting for a while, Ed quietly asked, Did everything go according to your plan? Lortel smiled playfully. Who exactly do you think I am? She explained that she had convinced one of the knights to deliberately draw everyone's attention toward himself. Ed couldn't understand how she had managed it. He even jokingly wondered whether she had taken the knight's family hostage. Lortel only gave an ambiguous smile. She neither confirmed nor denied it. If everything succeeds, I'll gain complete control of the Alti Merchant Association. Although she admitted she owed Ed an enormous debt, his reaction remained surprisingly dull. None of that interested him. He simply didn't care. Even so, Lortel smiled softly. Thank you. I'll never forget everything you've done for me. Ed answered without hesitation. I just want the 20 gold coins you promised. Nothing else. Lortel laughed. You'll get them. But before that, I want to ask you something. Ed immediately assumed she wanted to talk about Alice. Instead, she shook her head. I'll deal with Alice myself. What I wanted to ask is about Janika. She looked directly at him. You two seem very close. Ed nodded. She's a good person. Lortel agreed. She is. She's a kind upperclassman. Curious, Ed asked why she suddenly brought Janika up. Lortel took a deep breath. Then she quietly said, Janica isn't as gentle as she appears. Meanwhile, back at Ophelus' dormitory, Alti received a report from one of his subordinates. After hearing it, he completely lost interest in the dormitory and immediately left. Elsewhere, Ziggs was still fighting. Ironically, the greatest obstacle he faced wasn't Alte's mercenaries. It was Janica herself. Her overwhelming magic was destroying everything around her. Completely bewildered, Ziggs shouted, "What happened to you? Why are you so angry?" At that moment, a tiny spirit dove landed gently on Janika's shoulder. Without even looking at him, she calmly replied, "Who said I was angry?" The following day, Ed couldn't even attend class. His uniform had been completely destroyed. Ziggs brought him a spare one while explaining everything that had happened after the battle. In the end, Willen accepted full responsibility for the destruction of Ophelus' dormitory. As for Alice, even after being captured, the head maid remained completely silent. After everything that had happened, one of the scenario's key figures had successfully prevented Lortel from leaving the stage. Since Alte still hadn't made a move, all the signs pointed to one conclusion. The plan had worked. With everything unfolding according to schedule, Ed expected good news to arrive soon. Unfortunately, the recent incident had taken a heavy toll on his body. Every movement caused him pain, and even simple physical tasks had become exhausting. Checking his status window, Ed noticed he still had 2 empty crafting skill slots. He had already decided exactly what he wanted to learn. The first was Spiritual Formula Infusion, a skill perfectly suited for spiritual sorcery. The second was Magical Engineering, which would allow him to create both practical tools and powerful combat equipment. Learning Spiritual Formula Infusion required forming a contract with a spirit. Once he successfully created an item infused with spiritual awareness, the skill would unlock automatically. Magical Engineering worked differently. He only needed to successfully assemble and disassemble a magical device of the required level at least once. Since both skill slots were still empty, Ed decided there was no reason to waste any more time. For now, forming a contract with even a minor spirit would be enough. Just then, Janica arrived at his cabin. Ed looked surprised. "Shouldn't you be in class?" Janica smiled sheepishly. "My body still hurts. I wanted to rest for a while out here in the forest." Ed immediately became concerned. "Did you get hurt while helping me?" Before she could answer, Janica looked toward the cabin. "What about Lortel?" "She's fine," Ed replied. "She's resting inside." Janica quietly glanced toward the cabin. Meanwhile, Ed reflected on the situation. The Ophelus dormitory incident had finally come to an end. However, there was still unfinished business. For the next 3 days, Lortel needed to remain hidden inside the cabin while preparing for the negotiations involving the purchase of the sealed grimoire. Those 3 days felt incredibly long to her. Living in hiding filled her heart with anxiety. Still, it wasn't entirely unpleasant. Whenever she was around Ed, her heart raced. His kindness, his trust, the sense of safety he gave her to Lortel, those feelings were worth far more than mountains of gold. She never wanted to lose them, especially not to Janica. In Lortel's eyes, Janica had always lived a blessed life. She grew up surrounded by kindness, friends, and family. Lortel wanted that kind of happiness too. At least now, for the first time in her life, she decided she wouldn't give up. She would fight for Ed. After all, winning people's hearts was one of her greatest talents. Spending 3 entire days living together with him was an incredible advantage. For a moment, she even imagined burying the cabin in piles of gold just to impress him. Then she immediately realized how ridiculous that idea was. Besides, she didn't even have that much money. Maybe she could offer to pay his tuition instead. The mere thought of saying those words out loud made her face burn with embarrassment. Unable to contain herself, she repeatedly bumped her forehead against the cabin wall. Lortel had never had a boyfriend before. Perhaps that was why she felt so hopelessly awkward. Suddenly, the cabin door opened. "Move. That's my spot." Lortel blinked in confusion. Standing there was Lucy. Half asleep, Lucy yawned before casually explaining that this cabin was her favorite place to nap. Lortel stared at her. "What are you doing here?" Just then, Ed walked in. Without saying much, he picked Lucy up and carried her to a nearby abandoned cabin. After setting her down, he returned and apologized. "Sorry." Lucy snuck in again. "Now you can rest peacefully." Still confused, Lortel asked, "Does she come here often?" Ed sighed. "Don't think too much about her. She's basically a wild animal that occasionally wanders over to sleep in that corner." Lortel quietly processed those words. Then another thought crossed her mind. "So, I have another rival." Determined, she made a silent promise. "I'll settle this within 3 days." The following morning, on the second day, Lortel woke up excited. She planned to spend some time alone with Ed. Unfortunately, by the time she arrived, Janica was already there. Naturally, Lortel wasn't pleased. To make matters even worse, Lucy was still sleeping peacefully on the floor. All Lortel wanted was a few quiet moments alone with Ed. Meanwhile, Ed was admiring his newest project. Using handmade bricks he had crafted himself, he successfully built a proper brick fireplace inside the cabin. Lortel sniffed the air. The barbecue smells amazing. Did you season it? Ed nodded. Belle gave me some basil and a few other spices yesterday. Lortel smiled. If nothing unexpected happened this morning, then it's safe to assume our plan succeeded. Ed agreed. That's good news. But we still can't lower our guard. Lortel nodded before changing the subject. I still owe you your reward. Would you rather receive gold coins or goods? Ed thought for a moment. Construction materials would help. But do you happen to have any spare magical engineering tools? As they discussed business, Janica quietly watched from nearby. She clearly wasn't happy. A moment later, Ed turned toward her. I need another favor. He explained that he wanted to begin learning spiritual magic. If possible, I'd like to form a contract with at least a minor spirit. Can you help me? Janica's eyes sparkled. Of course. I'll be your teacher. I can even help you form a contract with an intermediate spirit. Proudly, she summoned her contracted spirit, Cherish. She asked the spirit to communicate with Ed. However, Cherish immediately shook its head. It won't work. Ed frowned. I can barely hear something. Cherish floated closer. Your spiritual sensitivity is still too low. Then it continued reading something invisible. According to your weekly report, your daily schedule is far too full. You have way too many tasks. Janica suddenly panicked. Wait. She looked at Ed nervously. Did you hear that? Ed nodded. I heard something about a weekly report. Janica's face instantly turned bright red. Before the conversation became even more awkward, Lortel smoothly stepped in and changed the subject. She returned to discussing the magical engineering tools. Turns out I have more stock than I expected. I can provide everything you need. Ed smiled. Could you give me a discount? I'd like to settle the matter of those 20 gold coins as soon as possible. Lortel pouted. A discount? That's practically giving them away for free. Those are valuable resources. Then she smiled. It might be difficult, but if you visit the Merchant Association every 3 days, I'll make sure you get a very fair price. She paused for a moment before casually adding, and while you're there, we could have tea together. Janica finally reached her limit. She immediately stood up. You can't just keep giving him things. He didn't even help you that much. Lortel calmly folded her arms. I'm a merchant. This is simply business. Janica frowned. That's just an excuse. The two girls immediately began arguing. Meanwhile, Ed quietly continued eating his meal. Watching them bicker, he casually thought that perhaps he could learn both magical engineering and spiritual formula infusion at the same time. Just then, Belle suddenly appeared outside the cabin. I'm sorry for dropping by without warning. I have more news. She informed everyone that Maya had officially become the new head maid. Then she handed Lortel a letter. It was from Alice. Elsewhere, back at the dormitory, laundry fluttered gently in the breeze. A student quietly approached Belle and Maya. Please don't tell anyone. It's a huge secret. She leaned in and whispered, I think Janica likes Ed Rothstaler. Belle blinked. For a moment she wondered whether pretending to be surprised would simply be the polite response. Looking at Clara, she asked, Are you worried about Janica? Clara sighed. I just don't understand how she could fall for a thug like him. And that's not even the biggest problem. Earlier, Janica also mentioned another girl, Lortel. Both girls had skipped the semester's opening ceremony. Both had also missed the very first class. To Clara, it looked exactly like a tug-of-war over Ed. At this rate, Janica doesn't stand a chance. She shook her head. Honestly, I don't understand Ed either. Is he just a cunning wolf? Or does he simply have a frozen heart? Belle tried to defend him. Maybe he's just going through a difficult time. He might not have room in his life for romance right now. Clara immediately rejected the idea. No, I'm convinced he's taking advantage of both of them. Belle remained silent. Then she quietly reflected on the situation. Luck really was a relative thing. Poor Ed was surrounded by a clever merchant capable of stealing anything, a kind-hearted girl powerful enough to accidentally destroy the academy, and another girl who spent most of her time sleeping. That didn't seem particularly lucky. Just thinking about it gave her a headache. At that moment, Lortel entered the room. What's going on? Belle handed her the letter. It's a message from former headmaid Alice. As night fell, Janica finally returned to the academy. Belle also carried the still-sleeping Lucy back to the dormitory. That bothered Ed slightly. Belle now knew exactly where Lortel was hiding. Even so, the situation remained manageable. Soon afterward, the carrier pigeon finally returned. Its message contained excellent news. The proposal to remove Alte as president of the Merchant Association had been reviewed. His dismissal was now almost guaranteed. Ed smiled. Looks like it's finally time to go back to class. Lortel nodded. If things have reached this point, my father is probably making his final stand at headquarters. But it's already hopeless. He won't have time to worry about me anymore. Ed remained cautious. Could Alte still have another trump card? Lortel thought for a moment. He's an incredibly clever man, so the possibility isn't zero. Even Islog, who wants to become the next president, is having a difficult time. At this point, all I can do is trust him. She sighed quietly. My biggest concern was Alice, but that problem also seems to have resolved itself. Ed looked at her seriously. What if Alice tells everyone that you were the one who orchestrated everything? Lortel calmly smiled. She doesn't have many options. After all, I already paid her in advance. Alice's only goal was to stand beside the eventual winner, whether that turned out to be Lortel or Alte. The letter Belle and Maya had delivered wasn't a threat at all. Instead, it contained a detailed list of every orphanage Alice personally supported, along with their annual maintenance costs and instructions on how to keep them operating. Alice had been carrying an overwhelming workload for years. Her health deteriorated day by day, yet the academy ignored every complaint she made. Eventually, her condition became so severe that she could no longer continue working. Without her, the orphanages she had spent years protecting would lose their support. She had gambled her own life to keep everything together. Unfortunately, almost no one realized how desperate her situation truly was. Only those closest to her understood the burden she had been carrying. After reading the document, Lortel calmly explained that Alice had sided with her because victory seemed inevitable. Even so, rebuilding Alice's trust would not be easy. She also emphasized that the list of orphanages wasn't meant as blackmail. It was simply proof of what Alice had been protecting all this time. Ed quietly looked through the documents. He couldn't help but think that the world of merchants had no room for sympathy. The moment someone made a mistake, everyone treated them like a fool. No one understood that harsh reality better than Lortel. There's nothing for Alice to gain by exposing the truth, she explained, so she'll simply go with the flow. In business, there are no permanent allies, and there are no permanent enemies. After finishing their discussion, Lortel announced that it was time for her to leave. Before going, she asked whether Ed would stop by the Merchant Association to sign their contract. He nodded. Then he handed her a torch. It should last a long time. Lortel accepted it and quietly stared at the flame. Ed noticed her unusual expression. What are you thinking about? She looked up at him. You're taller than I expected. Ed blinked in confusion. Why are you saying that all of a sudden? Lortel smiled faintly. Sometimes, winning requires taking risks, and you understand that better than anyone. As she spoke, she stepped closer and gently straightened his tie. The essence of every relationship is knowing when to keep your distance and when to get closer. Just like adjusting a tie. Ed looked down at his clothes. Does my outfit really bother you that much? Lortel shook her head. Not at all. It's simply important for academy students to look presentable. Then, without any warning, she grabbed his collar and kissed him, right on the lips. When she finally pulled away, she smiled mischievously. The raspberries we ate were delicious. Just remembering them makes me happy again. Completely caught off guard, Ed immediately tried to create some distance. Control yourself. Lortel pouted. You're so boring. Then she smiled once more. Next time, I'll get a little closer. After all, I also need to practice keeping my distance. With those teasing words, she turned around. Holding the torch Ed had given her, she disappeared into the forest using magic. Ed remained standing in place. His face slowly turned red. He couldn't help sighing. No matter how hard he tried to avoid becoming involved with the story's main characters, life never followed his plans. Instead of quietly staying in the background, he kept getting dragged toward the center of every major event. All he wanted was a peaceful life. His goals were simple: graduate from the academy, improve his stats, take care of the tasks necessary for his survival, and live quietly without getting involved in the world's biggest conflicts. Unfortunately, reality had other ideas. Time passed quickly. Before he even realized it, summer ended. Autumn had arrived. Meanwhile, Janica was spending time with her contracted spirits. One of them suddenly announced, Lortel kissed Ed. The spirit cherish immediately panicked. We have to do something. We can't just stand here. Janica blinked in confusion. What are you talking about? Another spirit, Tarkin, nodded. I saw it too. That redhead loves playing with other people's hearts. Janica nervously asked, how did Ed react? Tarkin folded his arms. He built a wall between them. She kissed him, and he responded with absolute indifference. It was so cold that even I felt embarrassed. According to him, there were only two possible explanations. Either the guy is completely impotent, or he simply doesn't see Lortel as a woman. Hearing that, Janica secretly felt relieved. Unfortunately, Tarkin wasn't finished. Men are usually good at attacking, not defending. And trust me, that redhead is incredibly attractive. If Ed really isn't interested in her, that's fantastic news for you. Janica frowned. I thought the spirit said his reaction was only lukewarm, not completely cold. Tarkin immediately challenged her. So, are you really going to let that redhead steal him? The other spirits quickly dragged Tarkin away before he could say anything worse. Even while being carried away, he continued shouting, Janica, you should kiss Ed too. Another spirit immediately objected. Don't listen to him. You're already charming exactly the way you are. Still, someone quietly asked, don't you want something a little more exciting with Ed? Janica smiled softly. I just want a moment where we can support and care for each other. Meanwhile, Ed was busy feeding Lucy. After taking one bite, Lucy slowly opened her eyes. This tastes awful. Ed couldn't even argue. Without seasoning, there's no way it tastes good. Lucy glared at him. I'm not your guinea pig. The story then explains that Ed's cooking skill had only reached level 6. Everyday skills were heavily influenced by a person's core attributes. For Ed, dexterity was his most important stat. However, focusing on only one attribute made overall growth incredibly inefficient. He understood that every stat needed to develop together. The problem was, he simply didn't have enough time. Between classes and everything else, he only had 5 or 6 hours each day to devote to improving his chances of survival. Even after cutting down on sleep and forcing his body to adapt to constant exhaustion, he still worried that he wasn't using his time efficiently enough. Even so, he couldn't ignore the main story. Every day he continued observing the Academy's most important students. Taylor, who studied in the combat division, rarely appeared, but seemed to be progressing steadily. His companion Alia continued fulfilling her support role without any issues. Princess Phinia also appeared to be doing well for the time being. However, Ed knew her inevitable conflict with Lortel was approaching. He would have to keep a close eye on both of them. As for the next heroine, Clarice, she wouldn't even enroll until the following year. There was no reason to worry about her yet. Naturally, Ed also continued watching Lortel. Although Alte had been removed from power much earlier than expected, it remained impossible to predict how that would change her future actions. One thing, however, hadn't changed. She still intended to obtain the sealed grimoire. The reason Ed had become even busier lately was because it was finally time to investigate the Academy building itself. After all, the final boss of this arc was Professor Glast. During his investigation, Ed also discovered another disturbing fact. Someone had secretly guided the takeover of Ophilis Dormitory from behind the scenes. Elsewhere, Professor Glast spoke with his assistant teacher, Claire Elfin. If your instincts are telling you that, you're probably right. Your intuition has always been excellent. Then his expression turned serious. But be careful. Don't overlook anything important. For example, the divine science thesis I asked you to find. Claire nodded. I'll search for it tomorrow morning. Meanwhile, inside Ophilis Dormitory, Claire's office was overflowing with investigation materials. Her assistant, Anise, informed her that every document related to the dormitory incident had finally been collected. Claire, who looked like she hadn't slept for nearly 5 days, thanked her. She knew this case demanded her full attention. Even though the investigation was almost finished, she was completely exhausted. No matter how many times she reviewed the evidence, one detail refused to make sense: Ed Rothstaler's involvement. The more she investigated him, the stranger everything became. Later, Ed visited the Alte Merchant Association. Lortel personally welcomed him. She smiled apologetically. I've been so busy lately that I completely forgot about our contract. You'll have to come back next week. To make up for it, I prepared some tea. She also informed him that all the magical engineering equipment he requested was ready for pickup. Ed narrowed his eyes suspiciously. If you've really been that busy, why did you spend so much time dressing up? Lortel blinked. Because I had a very important appointment today. Then she smiled. What do you think? Ed tilted his head. Important appointment? For just a moment, Lortel looked visibly flustered. It's nothing you need to worry about. She immediately changed the subject. So, how's the cabin coming along? It's almost finished, Ed replied. I only need furniture now. But I don't need anything expensive. Lortel nodded thoughtfully. I can't simply give things away. That would violate my professional ethics. Then she looked around. You work with wood, don't you? Ed nodded. Without another word, Lortel grabbed a nearby chair and deliberately snapped one of its legs. Then she looked at the broken chair with an exaggerated sigh. Oh no, this chair can't possibly be sold anymore. What a shame. I suppose I'll just have to give it away. Ed calmly took a sip of his tea and thanked Lortel. She quietly watched him for a moment before letting out a small sigh. How can someone show absolutely no change in expression? She then sat across from him and slowly leaned closer. I practically made my final move. And even after all that, you still don't see me as a woman. She smiled knowingly. But I see you as a man. And yes, it means exactly what you're thinking. She admitted that even all the help she had been giving him came with ulterior motives. Ed understood exactly where the conversation was heading. I know what kind of answer you're waiting for. Before he could finish, Lortel gently interrupted him. I'm not waiting for any answer. Then she smiled with the confidence of a seasoned merchant. But I've never entered a battle expecting to lose. One day, you won't be able to keep holding back forever. According to her, a merchant's smile should never change. Whether victory was guaranteed or defeat seemed inevitable, a true merchant always smiled the same way. After all, merchants never revealed what they were truly feeling. Later, back at Sylvania Academy, Janica happily greeted Ed. Shall we begin your first lesson? Ed nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. Janica raised one hand and a small flame appeared above her palm. Focus your magic. Try to establish a connection. Ed cautiously reached toward the flame. As the fire flickered, it slowly transformed into a tiny spirit. The spirit immediately introduced itself. It's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Mug. I'm honored to form a contract with you, Master Ed. Without taking a single breath, Mug continued talking. He enthusiastically explained weekly reports, evaluation meetings, selection records, organizational procedures, and every step that had led to him being chosen. The non-stop stream of information quickly overwhelmed excitement. I swear I'll serve you with all my heart. Listening to the energetic spirit, Ed couldn't help remembering the game. Back then, he had also obtained a spirit companion. They laughed together, celebrated victories together, fought side by side. Their bond had become incredibly strong. Even so, the emotions he felt now were completely different. Looking at Mug, Ed asked, "Why are you trying so hard?" Janica smiled proudly. "You asked for a high-quality spirit, so I selected one with exceptional magical efficiency." The screening process was actually very complicated. Ed looked surprised. "Who organized all that?" Janica answered without hesitation. "Tarkeen." Ed gently picked Mug up. "You're really warm." Janica nodded. "Once you form a contract with a spirit, you'll be able to feel both magical energy and physical warmth. But be careful. If your connection becomes too strong, the spirit will become extremely hot." Ed immediately began analyzing the mechanics. "So the stronger the connection, the greater the firepower?" Janica laughed. "Firepower is a funny way to describe it, but yes, that's basically how it works." Ed looked genuinely impressed. "So, he's basically a portable heater." Mug's abilities were immediately displayed. Connection level, 2. Excellent spiritual efficiency. Unique abilities, recovery, blessing, and explosion. Elemental affinity, fire magic. Ed carefully reviewed everything. As a talented magic student specializing in intermediate elemental spells, obtaining a spirit like Mug dramatically improved his chances of survival. After all, he no longer needed to worry about gathering firewood. Seeing his excitement, Janica smiled warmly. "I'm happy you're happy. You always look so serious. If you ever need help, just ask." She also promised to teach him how to strengthen his connection with Mug and improve his spiritual senses before their morning classes. According to her, mastering those fundamentals would allow him to grow much faster. She also wanted to begin teaching him spiritual combat. "I'll make time for it. I already have the right accessories. I'll bring them next time."